The early years of Caesar, survival and awakening in the Roman political storm. When Pompey the Great celebrated his unimaginably glorious triumph in 61 BC, the cheers of the Roman crowds were deafening, but standing quietly in that sea of people was a 39-year-old spectator who had achieved none of it, Gaius Julius Caesar. History remembers Caesar for his legendary boasts, "I came, I saw, I conquered," and his infamous romance with the Queen of Egypt. But all of that glory belongs to his later years. Before he ever touched the summit of power, Caesar's youth was defined by unimaginable adversity and relentless political crisis. A fallen patrician in a volatile era. In 100 BC, Caesar was born not on the elite Palatine Hill, but in the Subura, the crowded working-class slums of Rome. By blood, his family was pure patrician. The Julii traced their lineage back to the very foundation of the city, but after 6 centuries, the family name had decayed. Compared to the massive political dynasties of the Claudii or the Fabii, the Julii were completely marginalized. Over the past century, they had produced only a single consul. Caesar's father, Gaius, served as a mid-ranking praetor. His mother, Aurelia, came from the politically active Cotta family and provided him with a highly educated upbringing. His aunt Julia was married to the legendary warlord Marius, and his uncle Lucius would eventually become a consul. It was a respectable background, but in the hyper-competitive world of Rome, the family possessed neither massive wealth nor supreme political influence. This financial reality shaped his early education. Elite Roman families hired the most prestigious Greek scholars to tutor their sons. Caesar's family could not afford that luxury. His tutor was a Gaul who had studied in Alexandria. Fortunately, Caesar was exceptionally gifted. He poured himself into his studies, excelling in languages, mathematics, logic, history, and physical combat. But the late Roman Republic was tearing itself apart, and his quiet education did not last. The world fractured when Caesar was 9 years old. In 91 BC, the catastrophic social war erupted across Italy. His uncle Marius, his uncle Lucius, and his father Gaius were all dragged into the bloodshed. 3 years later, it was his uncle Lucius who pushed through the political compromise, the Lex Julia, that helped end the slaughter. That same year, a general who had fought under Marius leveraged his military success to secure the consulship. His name was Sulla. Shortly after, the Republic broke down entirely. The populist leader Marius and the aristocratic general Sulla fought a vicious political war over military command in the east. The dispute ended in violence. Sulla marched his legions into Rome and slaughtered the Marian faction, forcing Marius to flee to North Africa. The following year, Sulla marched east to fight Pontus, leaving the consul Cinna in charge of Rome. But Cinna was a hardcore Marian loyalist. He recalled Marius from exile, and the two men unleashed a psychotic wave of revenge upon the capital. During this massacre, 2 of Caesar's uncles were executed. Knowing that his own uncle by marriage had ordered the deaths of his blood relatives was a horrifying political lesson for the 13-year-old boy. The political violence soon compounded his personal tragedies. In 86 and 85 BC, Marius and Caesar's father both died. With Sulla bogged down in the Eastern Wars, the consul Cinna assumed total control of Rome. Desperate to consolidate his political alliances before Sulla returned, Cinna arranged for his own daughter to marry the 16-year-old Caesar. Because of his bloodline and this new political marriage, Caesar was forcefully dragged into the deadliest partisan conflict in Roman history. But shortly after the wedding, his new father-in-law, Cinna was murdered by his own troops in a mutiny. The following year, Sulla returned from the east. Backed by Pompey and Crassus, Sulla crushed the Marian forces, conquered Rome for a second time, and immediately launched his infamous bloody purge of the populist faction. As the nephew of Marius and the son-in-law of Cinna, Caesar was placed directly on the execution list. Fortunately, several high-ranking patricians begged for his life. Sulla reluctantly agreed to spare the boy, but he issued a brutal ultimatum. Caesar had to divorce Cinna's daughter. To the shock of the entire capital, the 18-year-old Caesar looked the terrifying dictator in the eye and flatly refused. The consequences were immediate. To avoid execution, Caesar fled Rome, escaping into exile in Asia Minor. But he refused to waste his time in hiding. Young Roman aristocrats typically spent these years studying in Greece or Rhodes. But those academic hubs were crawling with Roman elites, making it too easy for Caesar to be recognized and dragged back to the executioner. So, he chose the military. He enlisted under the provincial governor Minucius and was deployed to the kingdom of Bithynia in 81 BC. Shortly after, during the siege of Mytilene, Caesar fought with such raw physical courage that he was awarded the civic crown, one of Rome's highest military honors. In 78 BC, the dictator Sulla died of an illness. Caesar's exile was over, and he immediately resigned his military post to return to Rome. That same year, the consul Lepidus launched an armed rebellion against Sulla's constitution, but was crushed by Pompey. The populist faction was broken once again. Caesar was now 23 years old, staring at a highly uncertain future. Under Sulla's strict new laws, he was far too young to legally enter politics. To build his reputation and public profile, Caesar decided to become a trial lawyer. But his early legal career was a disaster. He lost his first two major cases against deeply entrenched elites and in the process painted a massive target on his own back. Facing the very real threat of political retaliation, Caesar found himself completely isolated in the capital. To escape the political heat, he left Rome to study rhetoric in Rhodes. But on the voyage across the Aegean, his ship was hijacked by pirates. The ruthless pirates demanded a ransom of 20 talents of silver, the equivalent of a lifetime's wages for 300 Roman soldiers. Facing death, the captive, bankrupt Caesar did not beg. Instead, he laughed in their faces, told them they had no idea who they had kidnapped, and demanded they raise the ransom to 50 talents. For 38 days he lived among them, treating them more like his own bodyguards than his executioners. Once the ransom was paid and he was released, Caesar did not let it go. He immediately raised a private naval fleet, hunted down the pirates, reclaimed his silver, and crucified every single one of his captors. In 74 BC, the king of Bithynia died and willed his entire kingdom to the Roman Republic. That same year, Caesar's uncle, Aurelius Cotta, finished his term as consul and was dispatched to govern the new province. For Caesar, this was a perfect opportunity to build his political resume, so he traveled east to join his uncle's staff. But Rome was distracted, bleeding resources into the grueling war against Sertorius in Spain. Seeing an opening, King Mithridates VI of Pontus launched a massive surprise attack on Bithynia. Caesar's uncle was a politician, not a general. He was easily defeated by the Pontic army and forced to flee. The newly acquired Roman province was lost instantly, and Caesar's latest attempt to build a political foundation collapsed before it even began. The following year, his uncle unexpectedly died. While Caesar did manage to secure a religious office as a pontiff, and later won an election as a minor military tribune, these titles offered no real executive power. In 73 BC, the catastrophic Spartacus rebellion erupted across Italy, but Caesar was never deployed to fight the slaves. His military rank was simply too low. He remained marginalized on the fringes of Roman politics. 2 years later, Pompey returned from Spain in triumph, and Crassus bathed in the glory of crushing the slave revolt. The two men leveraged their armies to secure the consulship, becoming the undisputed center of Roman power. In 69 BC, the 31-year-old Caesar was elected quaestor and assigned to a quiet, bureaucratic desk job in the province of Further Spain. While stationed there, he visited the Temple of Hercules in the city of Gades. As he stood before a statue of Alexander the Great, Caesar was suddenly overwhelmed. He broke down, weeping as he confessed, "At my age, Alexander had already conquered the world, and I have achieved absolutely nothing." The comparison was suffocating. He didn't even need to look at Alexander. His own Roman contemporaries had left him completely behind. Pompey, just 6 years older, was already a legendary army commander who had celebrated a massive triumph. Cicero, also 6 years older, was the undisputed heavyweight champion of the Roman courts. And what was Caesar? In Roman high society, he was dismissed as a heavily indebted playboy burning through borrowed money just to survive. Looking back at the first half of his life, his resume was a sequence of nightmares. He had lost his father and barely survived Sulla's bloody purges. He had tried the law and failed. He had been forced into exile, kidnapped by pirates, and watched his eastern ambitions evaporate on the battlefield. Standing alone before the statue, Caesar was forced into a brutal self-reckoning. He had to figure out what his life actually meant and where he was going. But this profound crisis at the age of 31 stripped away his illusions. It triggered a cold, singular obsession. He was going to return to Rome, and he was going to claw his way to the summit of the Republic. The Senate broken, the rise of Caesar and the first triumvirate. The age of Caesar was a critical tipping point. It was the exact moment the Roman Republic began its violent mutation into an empire. As the borders rapidly expanded, the ancient constitution buckled under the weight of massive, existential social conflicts. Past reformers like the Gracchi brothers, Saturninus, Marius, and Sulla had all tried to fix the machine, but they failed. They relied too heavily on either pure political legislation or pure military force. Ultimately, the man who synthesized both, the architect of this massive historical transition, was Julius Caesar. By 61 BC, Pompey the Great had conquered the East and returned to Rome in triumph. His next objective was the consulship. Heading into 60 BC, Caesar was preparing his own run for the same office. But the patrician elites in the Senate viewed both men as massive political threats, and they were not going to make it easy. Roman law created a strict, uncompromising catch-22. To run for consul, a candidate had to physically enter the city of Rome and register in person before the summer deadline. However, if a general wanted to celebrate a military triumph, he was forbidden from stepping foot inside the city limits until the day of the ceremony. The patricians used this legal contradiction against Caesar. If he wanted his triumph, he would miss the election deadline. If he wanted the consulship, he had to forfeit the triumph. For a man like Pompey, who had already thrown multiple triumphs and possessed massive global fame, skipping a parade meant nothing. But for Caesar, a triumph was a rare, critical opportunity to flaunt his military record and secure political capital. Yet, forced into a corner between vanity and actual authority, Caesar made a cold, pragmatic calculation. He forfeited the glory, crossed the city limits, and registered for the election. By dropping the triumph, Caesar lost a massive public relations advantage. He desperately needed a way to artificially boost his polling numbers. Across the city, Pompey was facing his own humiliating political crisis. Pompey had promised his veterans land upon their retirement. But without his army to force the issue, the conservative Senate simply stalled. They refused to reject the land grants outright, but they refused to execute them, leaving the legendary general paralyzed and publicly embarrassed. Recognizing their shared enemies, Caesar and Pompey approached the wealthiest man in Rome, Crassus. In 60 BC, these three political heavyweights forged a highly secretive, illegal alliance. History remembers it as the First Triumvirate. The alliance was built on sheer mutual necessity. Caesar was a brilliant political operator desperate for the consulship, but he lacked the fame and the voting base. Pompey had sky-high public approval and tens of thousands of veteran votes, but he needed a ruthless politician to pass his land bills. Crassus had bottomless wealth, held massive leverage over Caesar's debts, and desperately wanted to be treated as Pompey's political equal. Pooling their money, influence, and mob mechanics, the alliance worked perfectly. In 59 BC, the 40-year-old Caesar secured the consulship, sharing the office with a hardline conservative named Bibulus. Upon taking office, Caesar offered a performative olive branch. He proposed to his co-consul Bibulus that they follow the ancient tradition of alternating supreme executive and military authority month by month. The Senate initially relaxed, believing Caesar could be managed, but Caesar's subsequent moves systematically stripped the aristocracy of all their leverage. He started by tearing down the walls of the Senate. During his month in power, Caesar ordered that all daily debates, voting records, and resolutions be transcribed into a public journal, the Acta Diurna, and posted in the Roman Forum the very next morning. For the average citizen, this shattered the closed-door secrecy of the patrician elite. By dragging the Senate's backroom deals into the daylight, Caesar secured massive public approval. When February arrived and Bibulus took executive control, Caesar leveraged that new public support to bypass the Senate floor entirely. He used an allied tribune to take legislation directly to the citizen assembly. Through this loophole, he formally ratified Pompey's reorganization of the eastern provinces, solving one of Pompey's biggest political headaches. When Caesar retook the reins in March, he launched an economic offensive. He passed severe anti-corruption and anti-extortion laws, brutally cracking down on provincial governors and loan sharks. This further cemented his popularity. Then, at the height of his political momentum, he dropped the bombshell, the Julian agrarian law. In Rome, land redistribution was highly volatile, often ending in bloodshed. But Caesar's bill was meticulously moderate. It capped public land ownership at roughly 600 acres, forcing the state to buy back the excess at fair market value. Land could be resold, but only after 20 years of continuous farming. The newly acquired plots would be prioritized for Pompey's combat veterans and urban families with 3 or more children. To ensure the Senate couldn't complain about the budget, the entire program was funded directly by the plunder Pompey had dragged back from the east. Even with these moderate terms, the Senate stubbornly refused to pass it. Caesar anticipated this. He presented the bill to the Senate floor, fully expecting a fight. Cato the Younger, a hardline conservative, attempted to kill the bill with a filibuster, intending to speak from dawn until dusk. Caesar didn't play along. Before Cato could finish, Caesar ordered armed guards to physically drag him out of the Senate house. Declaring that the Senate was incapable of functioning, Caesar took the bill straight to the citizen assembly. The forum was packed, heavily stacked with Pompey's restless veterans. Caesar orchestrated a flawless piece of political theater. He invited Cato onto the stage, only to have him physically removed again, shattering the opposition's morale. Then the conservative co-consul Bibulus tried to step up and block the vote, but he was shouted down and terrified into submission by the crowd. With the opposition silenced, Caesar brought out his allies. Crassus delivered a rousing speech to thunderous applause. Then Pompey, the most respected man in Rome, took the stage. Knowing Pompey was a terrible public speaker, Caesar guided him. Caesar read the land bill aloud, line by line, pausing after each clause to formally ask for Pompey's endorsement. Every time Pompey nodded, the veterans erupted. After finishing the reading, Caesar proposed that Pompey personally oversee the land distribution and asked the general to speak to the crowd. Swept up in the frenzy, Pompey drew his sword and roared, "If anyone dares to draw a sword against this law, I will meet him with sword and shield." Faced with the threat of military violence and a rabid mob, Bibulus surrendered the republic. The law passed. Humiliated and terrified, the conservative consul locked himself inside his house and refused to participate in the government for the rest of the year. Caesar effectively ruled Rome as the sole consul for the remaining 9 months. Having secured Pompey's loyalty, Caesar turned to Crassus. As the richest man in Rome, Crassus heavily invested in tax farming syndicates. The state required these syndicates to pay 1/3 of their expected tax yields up front. Crassus wanted this prepayment abolished to free up his massive cash reserves. Normally, the Senate would have instantly killed such a blatant corporate bailout. But Caesar presented a cold, pragmatic argument. He stated that forcing tax collectors to pay up front meant they had to ruthlessly extort the provinces to recoup their margins, damaging the long-term stability of the empire. Furthermore, if the state abolished the prepayment, the collector's final cut would be reduced. Caesar promised to reroute those saved funds directly to the provinces for infrastructure development. By perfectly balancing state revenue and provincial welfare, Caesar left the Senate with no logical counterargument. The bill passed, Crassus got his liquidity, and Caesar looked like a visionary statesman. In just 6 months, Caesar had expertly manipulated the system to give both of his powerful allies exactly what they wanted. Now, it was time to secure his own future. He solidified his political base by marrying Calpurnia. Then, using his allied tribune, he shattered another ancient tradition. Instead of taking a standard 1-year governorship after his consulship, Caesar secured command over 3 highly strategic provinces: Cisalpine Gaul, Transalpine Gaul, and Illyricum. He locked this command in for a massive 5-year term and secured the loyalty of 4 veteran legions. Before leaving Rome, Caesar rigged the board. He ensured that the consuls and tribunes elected for the following year were his personal loyalists. Even while away governing his provinces, Caesar would be able to remotely control the levers of the Republic. In the year 59 BC, Julius Caesar completely rewired the power structure of the Roman Republic. He had proven his mastery of political warfare, but politics was no longer enough. The next phase of his life required military glory. Armed with his legions, Caesar prepared to march north into the brutal, uncharted territories of Gaul and Germania. triggering a chain of events that would violently alter the course of Western history. The opening Gambit, the Helvetii migration, and the war for the Rhine. From 58 to 51 BC, the Roman governor Julius Caesar waged a relentless war of conquest, annexing the entirety of Gaul into the Roman Empire. This campaign did more than flood Rome with slaves and plunder. It forged the massive military and political capital Caesar needed to ultimately dictate the future of the Republic. In late 59 BC, Caesar finished his term as consul. To maintain remote control over the capital, the first triumvirate rigged the elections, placing their loyalists in high office. Caesar then departed to govern three highly strategic provinces: Illyricum, Cisalpine Gaul, and Transalpine Gaul. Geographically, these regions guarded the northern approaches to Rome. Politically, they offered exactly what Caesar desperately needed: a staging ground to build his military legacy. Just beyond the Roman border, the Rhine River divided the Germanic tribes to the east from the Gallic tribes to the west. In early 58 BC, Caesar received urgent intelligence. The Helvetii, a massive Celtic tribe living in the Swiss mountains, were preparing to migrate. Crushed by constant Germanic raids, over 300,000 men, women, and children were planning to abandon their homeland and march toward the northwestern coast of France. Their proposed route cut directly through a Roman province. For Caesar, this was a geopolitical disaster. If the Helvetii abandoned their mountain homeland, the vacuum would be instantly filled by expanding Germanic tribes, destroying a critical strategic buffer zone. Furthermore, allowing 300,000 people to march through Roman territory was an unacceptable security risk. Caesar flatly rejected their request for passage and ordered his veteran 10th Legion to mobilize at the border. Blocked by Rome, the Helvetii negotiated a new route through the territory of the Aedui, a Gallic tribe. Legally, a Roman governor had no jurisdiction outside his province, but Caesar operated on grand strategy, not border technicalities. In May of 58 BC, he took the initiative, crossed the border, and actively hunted the migrating tribe. The two forces first clashed at the Saone River. Because the bulk of the Helvetii had already crossed the water, the Roman legions only managed to wipe out their rearguard. The surviving migration still boasted over 90,000 able-bodied warriors, outnumbering Caesar's legions 3-1. For the next 2 weeks, Caesar cautiously shadowed the horde. But when the Roman army broke off to secure grain at the Aedui capital of Bibracte, the Helvetii misread the maneuver as a retreat. They turned their massive army around and attacked. This triggered the first major engagement of the Gallic Wars, the Battle of Bibracte. Caesar deployed his cavalry to harass the enemy while he formed his infantry lines on a hillside. He anchored the slope with his veteran 7th, 8th, 9th, and 10th legions, leaving his two newly recruited legions to guard the baggage train at the summit. After brushing aside the Roman cavalry, the Helvetii locked their shields into a dense phalanx and charged directly up the hill. The Romans held the high ground and unleashed a devastating volley of heavy javelins. The iron tips of the Roman pila were designed to bend upon impact. When they pierced the Gallic wooden shields, they could not be pulled out. Weighed down and entangled by the heavy shafts, the Helvetii warriors were forced to drop their shields and charge the Roman lines completely unprotected. The uphill assault turned into a slaughter. Bleeding and exhausted, the Helvetii were pushed back and retreated to a nearby hill to regroup. As the Roman legions advanced to finish them, the battlefield shifted violently. The Helvetian rearguard, tasked with protecting their baggage train, suddenly arrived and struck the Roman flank. The Roman infantry was instantly trapped in a massive pincer movement. Unfazed, Caesar split his formation. He ordered his first two lines to hold the frontal assault and physically rotated his third line to face the new threat in the rear. The infantry engaged in a suffocating, bloody melee that lasted from noon until dusk. The Roman legions ground the enemy down, forcing the frontal assault back and driving the rearguard all the way to their baggage camp. To secure total victory, the Romans assaulted the fortified camp, fighting through the night until it was completely overrun. The Battle of Bibracte ended with the destruction of the Helvetii host. The surviving 110,000 Helvetii fled northeast, but starving and hunted, they surrendered 3 days later. Caesar forced them to return to their ruined homeland and rebuild the buffer zone. The victory made Caesar the undisputed power broker of the region. Following the battle, Gallic leaders flocked to Bibracte, begging Caesar to intervene against a terrifying new threat crossing the Rhine: the Germanic tribes. For years, the Germanic Suebi tribe had been eyeing the lands west of the Rhine. During a bitter civil war between two southern Gallic tribes, the losing faction made a fatal mistake. They invited the Suebi warlord Ariovistus to cross the river as a mercenary. Ariovistus crushed their enemies, but he refused to leave. He seized a third of his employer's territory, subjugated the surrounding Gallic tribes, and demanded heavy tribute, threatening total annihilation if they refused. The Gauls begged Rome for mediation. Caesar recognized the fatal geopolitical trajectory. If the highly aggressive Germanic tribes were allowed to migrate across the Rhine, they would systematically devour Gaul and eventually threaten the northern borders of Italy. He initiated a diplomatic front, officially ordering Ariovistus to halt his aggression and requesting a meeting. Ariovistus responded with pure arrogance. He declared that Rome had no right to interfere with his conquests and openly challenged the Roman legions to test his military strength. Shortly after, Roman scouts reported that Ariovistus had mobilized his army and was marching toward Vesantio, a critical supply hub holding the river valley. Caesar recognized the strategic value of the city. He force-marched his legions day and night, arriving just in time to lock down Vesantio before the Germanic army could reach it. Despite the strategic victory, the Roman camp descended into psychological panic. The Germanic warriors were famous for their massive physical size and unmatched ferocity. Furthermore, no Roman army had fought the Germanic tribes in 40 years, dating back to the days of Marius. The fear of the unknown paralyzed the ranks. Officers and soldiers alike began drafting their last wills and testaments. Seeing panic take root, Caesar summoned his commanders. He went on the offensive, reminding them that Marius had utterly annihilated these exact same Germanic tribes, and that Roman legions had already crushed the Germanic gladiators during the Spartacus rebellion. He laid out the cold mathematics of the battlefield. Rome held a clear numerical advantage, fielding 30,000 men against 20,000. Then Caesar delivered his ultimate ultimatum. He declared that if the army was too terrified to fight, he would march out tomorrow morning with only the 10th Legion, and they would face the enemy alone. The psychological manipulation worked. Shamed by their commander, the legions demanded to fight. In early September of 58 BC, the two armies met near the Vosges Mountains. After a tense, failed negotiation, Ariovistus executed a bold, tactical maneuver. He marched his army through the dense forests, bypassed the Roman vanguard, and camped directly behind Caesar, severing the Roman supply lines. Caesar countered the blockade by marching his entire army toward the Germanic position, constructing a second heavily fortified camp just a kilometer away, locking the two forces in a standoff. But the Suebi refused to launch a full-scale assault. Even when the Romans marched out and offered battle daily, Ariovistus held his ground. Through interrogating prisoners, Caesar uncovered the reason. The Germanic tribes were bound by a pagan prophecy. Their seers had declared that if they fought before the new moon, they would be destroyed. Recognizing their vulnerability, Caesar turned their own superstition against them. But on the opposite side of the battlefield, the sheer weight of the Germanic right wing was crushing the Roman left. As the Roman line began to buckle, a young cavalry officer named Publius Crassus, the son of the wealthiest man in Rome, read the battlefield perfectly. Without waiting for orders, he deployed the third-line infantry reserve, slamming them into the failing left wing. The reinforcement stabilized the line and broke the enemy's momentum. With the Roman advance renewed across the entire front, the Suebi defense shattered. Recognizing the defeat, Ariovistus and his surviving warriors fled toward the Rhine, hunted and slaughtered by Roman cavalry all the way to the water. The Germanic reinforcements waiting to cross the river heard of the massacre and immediately turned back to the eastern bank. Following the battle, Caesar garrisoned his army at Vesontio for the winter and returned to Cisalpine Gaul to manage the provincial administration. In the campaigns of 58 BC, Rome had decisively crushed both the Gauls and the Germanic tribes. More importantly, Caesar established the Rhine River as a hard geopolitical border, a physical barrier that would define Roman defense strategy for centuries. Caesar had secured his foothold in the south, but his violent expansion terrified the Belgic tribes in northern Gaul. To ensure their own survival, they formed a massive military coalition, assembling over 300,000 warriors. Facing an overwhelming numerical disadvantage, Caesar and his 60,000 men would march north the following spring. The meat grinder of Gaul, the Belgic coalition in the Conference of Lucca. The massive army rising to challenge Caesar belonged to the Belgic coalition from northeastern Gaul. This was a formidable alliance of 12 tribes sharing bloodlines with the Germanic people. They were notoriously fierce, having previously defeated the Cimbri and Teutones, tribes that had once threatened Rome itself. They were widely considered the most lethal fighters in all of Gaul. To counter this anti-Roman coalition, Caesar raised 2 new legions in 57 BC and hired Numidian cavalry and Cretan archers. He now commanded 8 veteran legions, totaling roughly 60,000 men. But the Belgic coalition, led by the Suessiones, the Nervi, and the Bellovaci, had mobilized over 300,000 warriors. Facing a 5-to-1 disadvantage, Caesar knew that engaging in an open head-on collision meant total annihilation. In May of that year, Caesar force-marched his legions for 15 days, suddenly appearing on the borders of the Remi, a Belgic tribe. Caught completely off guard, the Remi surrendered and pledged loyalty to Rome. Meanwhile, the coalition of 300,000 men was marching south to besiege the Remi town of Bibrax. The Remi begged Rome for protection. Knowing he had to defend his new allies to maintain his authority, Caesar dispatched troops to break the siege. The coalition abandoned the town and continued south, eventually meeting the Roman legions at the Exona River. Caesar anchored his camp on high ground at the confluence of the Exona and a small stream, fortifying his flanks with deep trenches and palisades. A massive swamp protected his western flank, and a bridge to the south secured his supply lines. He placed his lieutenant Sabinus in command of 3,000 men to guard the bridge, locking the enemy into a tactical stalemate. Facing 300,000 warriors across the river, the Roman defensive engineering proved its worth. The heavy marshland between the two armies was impassable. Both sides waited for the other to cross, hoping to slaughter them in the mud. Soon, the coalition discovered a shallow ford downstream and attempted to cross, intending to flank the Romans and sever their supply lines. When scouts reported the movement, Caesar personally led his light cavalry and infantry to intercept them. The Romans hit the coalition forces while they were mid-crossing. Chaos erupted in the water. The vanguard on the southern bank was almost entirely wiped out, and countless Belgic warriors drowned or were trampled to death trying to retreat. Simultaneously, Caesar executed a brutal strategic diversion. He had ordered his Aedui allies to attack the undefended homelands of the Bellovaci while their warriors were deployed at the front. When news of the invasion reached the coalition camp, their morale completely shattered. The tribes broke rank and scrambled north to defend their own territories. The coalition of 300,000 warriors disintegrated before the battle even began. Caesar immediately exploited the fractured coalition, hunting them down one by one. Utilizing massive siege towers and battering rams, he forced the Suessiones, the Bellovaci, and the Ambiani to open their gates and surrender without spilling a drop of Roman blood. Only the Nervii chose to fight to the death. They were a fiercely disciplined warrior culture, specializing in elite infantry combat. To neutralize cavalry attacks, they had spent years cultivating dense, thorny hedges throughout their territory, creating a landscape perfectly designed for ambushes. Supported by the Atrebates and the Viramandui, the Nervii assembled an army of 75,000 men. In July of 57 BC, the two armies converged at the Sabis River. The Nervii had a single clear tactical objective: destroy the Roman baggage train. That day, the Roman cavalry vanguard crossed the river to scout. They spotted scattered enemy skirmishers in the woods on the opposite bank and engaged them, assuming it was a minor screening force. Faced with a devastating surprise attack by the enemy's main force, Caesar instantly ordered the red standard raised and the horns blown, commanding the men to drop their shovels and form ranks. In a terrifying, chaotic environment where unified command was impossible, the brutal discipline of the Roman military took over. Without waiting for orders, the soldiers spontaneously formed small combat units and engaged the surging enemy in a desperate, point-blank melee. Caesar rode furiously across the lines to anchor the panic. On the left wing, the 9th and 10th legions absorbed the charge. In the center, the 8th and 11th legions actually began pushing the enemy back down the hill. But the right wing, held by the 7th and 12th legions, was collapsing. They were fighting the elite corps of the Nervii army. The Roman formation was compressed so tightly that the soldiers did not even have room to raise their shields or swing their swords. Casualties mounted, and the line was seconds away from a total rout. Using their superior numbers, the Nervii were slowly enveloping the Roman flanks. In this critical moment, Caesar grabbed a shield from a soldier in the rear and plunged directly into the front lines. Seeing their supreme commander fighting shoulder to shoulder with them in the mud electrified the infantry. The Roman soldiers surged with adrenaline, locking their shields and halting the Nervii advance. The battlefield stalled in a horrific, bloody stalemate until the 13th and 14th legions, who had been guarding the baggage train, finally arrived. They slammed into the Nervii flanks, stopping the envelopment. Simultaneously, the 10th Legion, led by Labienus, captured the enemy camp across the river, wheeled around, and struck the Nervi from behind, delivering a fatal blow. The tide instantly reversed, but the Nervi refused to break. They stood on the corpses of their own men and fought until the very last warrior fell. The Battle of the Sabes ended in a catastrophic Pyrrhic victory for Rome. The Nervi fighting force was virtually exterminated. Out of 60,000 men, barely 500 survived. After the slaughter, Caesar showed mercy to the remaining women, children, and elderly. He allowed them to return to their lands and explicitly ordered the surrounding tribes not to harm them. With the Nervi broken, the pacification of Belgica was complete. While Caesar was carving out a military legend in Gaul over those 2 years, the political war in Rome between the populists and the patricians was escalating. Pompey, stranded in the capital, watched Caesar's rising glory with growing resentment. The patrician elite smelled the fracture in the triumvirate and moved to tear it apart from the inside. In 57 BC, at the urging of Cicero, the Senate appointed Pompey to oversee the national grain supply. This functionally handed Pompey control over the entire Roman navy and significant ground forces. Recognizing the danger, Caesar invited Crassus to meet in Ravenna in the spring of 56 BC, and the two men traveled to Lucca. Pompey, who was originally sailing for Sardinia, altered his course and joined them. Unlike their secret pact 3 years prior, the Conference of Lucca was a massive public display of power. Over 200 senators and politicians flocked to the city just to be near them. At Lucca, the triumvirate carved up the world. They agreed that Pompey and Crassus would serve as consuls in 55 BC. Afterward, Pompey would govern Spain, and Crassus would govern Syria, both securing massive 5-year terms. Caesar's command in Gaul was extended for another 5 years. Each man would command 10 legions, locking the Republic in a 3-way military monopoly. Caesar would conquer Gaul, Pompey would lock down the Iberian Peninsula and secure the political rear, and Crassus would command the east to pressure the Parthian Empire. The Conference of Lucca solidified the alliance, and the center of Roman political gravity permanently shifted into the hands of these 3 men. With the politics settled, Caesar returned to Gaul to finish the job. In the summer of 56 BC, he unleashed his lieutenants across the territory. Labienus locked down Belgica, young Crassus pinned down Aquitania, and Sabinus and Decimus Brutus launched a joint land and sea offensive to crush the Veneti. Functionally, the entirety of Gaul had been absorbed into the Roman Empire. In the summer of 55 BC, to terrorize the Germanic tribes on the eastern bank of the Rhine, Caesar built a massive wooden bridge, marched his legions across, and ravaged their territory for 2 weeks, just to prove he could. Shortly after, he launched 2 armed reconnaissance expeditions across the English Channel into the uncharted territory of Britain. On the surface, Gaul was subdued, but beneath the soil of this massive new territory, rage was festering. The scattered tribes of Gaul were finally beginning to realize that if they did not unite to kill Julius Caesar, their civilization would be erased. The death of Gaul, Vercingetorix, and the siege of Alesia. In 54 BC, Caesar concluded his second armed reconnaissance into Britain and returned to Gaul. That year, a catastrophic drought triggered massive crop failures across the region. To prevent a centralized grain crisis from destroying his army, Caesar was forced to scatter his legions, garrisoning them deep inside the territories of various Gallic tribes before winter hit. But years of endless warfare and brutal Roman requisitioning had pushed the Gauls to the breaking point. The spark of rebellion ignited in the northeast, among the Eburones. Led by Ambiorix, the tribe executed a flawless deception, luring the Roman general Sabinus and his 9,000 soldiers out of their winter camp. The entire Roman detachment was massacred. Immediately after, an insurgent force of 60,000 men surrounded the winter camp commanded by Cicero's younger brother. Caesar arrived just in time to break the siege and save the legion, but the illusion of Roman control in Gaul was shattering. While Gaul was burning, the political foundation in Rome was collapsing. In September of 54 BC, Caesar's daughter Julia, who was married to Pompey, died in childbirth. The blood tie binding the two most powerful men in Rome was severed. Then, in June of the following year, Crassus was annihilated by the Parthian Empire at the Battle of Carrhae. With Crassus dead and Julia gone, the first triumvirate was destroyed. Unchecked, Pompey began to merge his power with the conservative Senate, and the partisan war against Caesar's populist faction exploded into massive, bloody street brawls in the capital. The chaos in Rome gave the Gauls the perfect opportunity. In early 52 BC, a 30-year-old chieftain raised the banner of total rebellion. His name was Vercingetorix. Within days, his call to arms unified disparate tribes across the territory. From modern-day Paris to Provence, the entirety of Gaul rose up in open revolt. When the intelligence reached Caesar, he immediately recognized this was not an isolated mutiny. He left his headquarters and raced back to Gaul. To buy time for his legions to mobilize, he used brutal military intimidation to force key tribes into neutrality while simultaneously dispatching troops to lock down the borders of the Roman province of Narbonensis. The final showdown between Vercingetorix and Caesar had begun. Drafting fresh recruits along the way, Caesar executed a terrifying forced march through the dead of winter. He pushed his men over the deep snows of the Cevennes Mountains, launching a surprise strike directly into the heart of Vercingetorix's homeland. Forced to abandon his offensive, Vercingetorix rushed back to defend his territory. Caesar exploited this exact reaction. The moment the Gallic army moved south, Caesar violently cut north, linking up with his 8 veteran legions. Realizing he had been outmaneuvered, Vercingetorix pivoted. He began besieging Gallic tribes that remained loyal to Rome. It was a vicious, strategic trap. If Caesar ignored his allies, the rest of Gaul would see Rome as weak and join the rebellion. If Caesar marched to save them, Vercingetorix could dictate the terms of the engagement on his own turf. To maintain Roman credibility, Caesar surrendered the initiative and marched his 6 legions to relieve the siege. But as the Romans approached, Vercingetorix abandoned the siege and issued a ruthless command: total scorched earth. The Gauls systematically burned their own villages, farmlands, and grain stores to ash. Vercingetorix intended to starve the Roman legions to death, waiting to slaughter Caesar's foraging parties when they broke off to find food. This scorched earth suicide pact worked. Caesar was starving. Worse, the Aedui, the only tribe still supplying Rome with grain, suffered an internal coup. If the anti-Roman faction took control, Caesar would be completely cut off and trapped behind enemy lines. He was forced to halt his pursuit, turn around, and violently intervene in Aedui politics to install a pro-Roman puppet. Desperate for manpower, he drafted 10,000 Gallic infantry from the tribe and resumed his hunt for Vercingetorix. Securing his fragile supply line, Caesar split his forces. He sent his lieutenant Labienus north with 4 legions to crush the uprisings near Paris, while he took his 6 veteran legions and marched directly on Vercingetorix's heavily fortified stronghold, Gergovia. Gergovia sat on a massive plateau, towering 350 meters above the valley floor. Surrounded by dense forests and jagged terrain, it was a near impregnable fortress. The siege stalled into a grinding, brutal stalemate. Seeing the Romans bogged down, Vercingetorix launched a psychological strike. He infiltrated the Aedui camp and used massive bribes and rumors to convince the tribe to betray Rome. 10,000 Aedui warriors mobilized and marched directly on Caesar's rear. Caesar was forced to split his army again. Leaving just 2 legions to maintain the siege, he took 4 legions to intercept the betrayal. Vercingetorix instantly capitalized on the weakened Roman lines, launching relentless assaults on the remaining 2 legions. Facing overwhelming numbers, the Roman siege camp was on the verge of collapse. After violently pacifying the Aedui, Caesar force-marched his men 45 miles in a single day, arriving just in time to save his camp from being overrun. Bleeding momentum, Caesar made a desperate gamble. One night he sent a decoy force into the western woods, creating the illusion of a massive flanking maneuver. Vercingetorix took the bait, pulling heavy infantry to reinforce his western gates. Sensing the southern defenses were thin, Caesar launched a dual assault. One force struck the east, while another executed a stealth climb up the southern cliffs. The Roman infantry breached the southern wall and pushed toward the main citadel. Exhausted and enraged by weeks of starvation, the Roman soldiers fought with terrifying savagery. Realizing he had been tricked, Vercingetorix violently shifted his main force back to the breach. Seeing the massive Gallic counterattack forming, Caesar ordered the retreat to preserve his men. But the 8th Legion ignored the order. Drunk on bloodlust and scaling the walls, they refused to pull back and pressed the assault. Caesar was forced to commit more troops to save them, personally leading the 10th Legion to cover the chaotic retreat. Vercingetorix ordered a total countercharge, driving the Roman infantry all the way down to the valley floor. When the Gauls hit the flat ground, Caesar's legions spun around and locked into a shield wall. Knowing his men would be slaughtered in a pitched battle on open terrain, Vercingetorix ordered them back behind the walls. The reckless assault was a disaster. The Roman legions suffered horrific casualties, losing dozens of veteran centurions. After severely punishing the mutinous troops, Caesar recognized that Gergovia could not be taken. He broke the siege and marched north to reunite with Labienus. Across Gaul, the retreat was celebrated as a monumental Roman defeat. Vercingetorix's prestige skyrocketed, drawing nearly every neutral tribe into the rebellion. Even the Aedui formally defected. Gaul was finally entirely united. Swelling with massive reinforcements, Vercingetorix expanded the Scorched Earth campaign and sent raiding parties south to strike Roman territory. Overnight, the geopolitical board had collapsed. Facing a unified Gaul, Caesar briefly considered abandoning the conquest entirely and retreating to Italy. Instead, he hired an elite force of Germanic cavalry from across the Rhine. As the Roman army marched south, Vercingetorix believed the moment had come to annihilate Caesar once and for all. He launched 80,000 men to intercept the retreat. But in the ensuing clash, Caesar's newly hired Germanic cavalry proved devastating, completely shattering the Gallic horsemen. Outmaneuvered in the open field, Vercingetorix was forced to abandon his baggage train and retreat to the heavily fortified hilltop of Alesia. Caesar instantly seized the initiative. He stopped retreating, turned his 11 legions around, and marched straight for Alesia. Alesia was a smaller version of Gergovia, a massive plateau ringed by mountains and rivers. Vercingetorix garrisoned the high ground with 80,000 men. Caesar had just over 60,000. Outnumbered and remembering the disaster at Gergovia, Caesar refused to assault the walls. He realized Alesia was an island. If he severed its supply lines, the 80,000 men inside would starve. Caesar ordered the construction of the most massive, sophisticated siege works in military history. The Roman legions built a 10-mile wall wrapping entirely around the base of the plateau, anchored by 23 fortified towers. To stop the Gauls from breaking out, Caesar constructed a nightmare of defenses in front of the wall. He dug 2 massive trenches, flooding the inner trench with river water. In front of the trenches, he planted dense rows of sharpened wooden spikes. Beyond that, he dug 8 rows of concealed pitfall traps lined with iron stakes. And on the outermost edge, the ground was seeded with iron hooks designed to tear through men and horses. Watching the Romans build a cage of death around his army, Vercingetorix launched a desperate breakout attempt into the western plains. Caesar deployed his Germanic cavalry. The Gallic horsemen were slaughtered, and the Roman infantry advanced, driving the survivors back behind the walls. Realizing he could not break the siege from the inside, Vercingetorix made a final apocalyptic gamble. Just before the Roman walls completely closed, he sent his remaining 15,000 cavalry out into the night. Their orders were to slip through the gaps, return to their tribes, and mobilize every fighting man in Gaul to march on Alesia. Vercingetorix bet the survival of his army on this massive relief force. Inside the walls, he had enough grain to last exactly 1 month. When Caesar learned that a massive Gallic army was being mobilized to crush him from the outside, he made a decision that defied military logic. He did not retreat. Instead, he ordered his men to turn around and build a second outward-facing wall, stretching 13 miles around the Roman position. Caesar trapped his own army between 2 massive fortifications. He prepared to simultaneously starve out the 80,000 men inside Alesia while defending against the entirety of Gaul from the outside. 40 days passed. Outside, the Gallic tribes had assembled a terrifying relief force of 250,000 warriors, and they were marching on Alesia. Inside the walls, Vercingetorix's grain supply was completely gone. To keep his soldiers alive, he made a horrific calculation. He expelled all the elderly women and children from the city, hoping the Romans would show mercy and take them as prisoners. But locked in a fight for his own survival, Caesar coldly refused to open his gates. The Gallic civilians were trapped in the wasteland between the 2 walls, and they slowly starved to death. Just as the defenders reached total despair, the massive Gallic relief army arrived. They camped on the western heights, placing immense psychological pressure on the outer Roman ring. The next day, the relief commander Commius launched a massive cavalry assault from the west. Seeing the arrival of the reinforcements, Vercingetorix immediately mobilized the starving defenders and attacked the inner Roman wall. Because the Roman defenses were littered with traps and trenches, the Gauls bled heavily just trying to reach the barricades. Caesar deployed artillery and archers on the walls, raining suppressing fire on both sides, while sending his Germanic cavalry outside the gates to fight the relief force. The air was thick with arrows, rocks, and javelins. Thousands of Gauls died in the spike pits before even touching the Roman walls. After a brutal afternoon of slaughter, the Germanic cavalry broke the outer Gallic horsemen, and Vercingetorix failed to breach the inner line. Both sides pulled back. The next night, the outer Gallic army launched a surprise attack in the dark. Hearing the battle roar, Vercingetorix ordered his men forward, carrying ladders and bundles of wood to fill the trenches under the cover of archery fire. The Roman legions responded with devastating artillery barrages from heavy catapults and ballistas. The slaughter lasted until dawn, but the double-walled Roman defense held. After 3 failed assaults, the outer Gallic commanders realized they could not break the siege through brute force. They had to find a structural flaw. They discovered that at the base of Mount Rhea, the Roman outer wall had a critical weakness. The mountain was too massive to enclose, forcing the Roman engineers to build the wall on the lower slope. If the Gauls attacked from the peak, they would have a massive geographical advantage. Under the cover of night, 60,000 elite Gallic warriors secretly marched behind Mount Rhea. At noon the next day, they erupted from the summit, charging down like an avalanche onto the vulnerable northwestern Roman camp. That sector was defended by only 10,000 Roman infantry. Seeing the massive assault from his citadel, Vercingetorix threw everything he had left at the inner Roman walls, coordinating with the relief force to break the southern and northwestern sectors simultaneously. From his observation tower, Caesar watched the battlefield disintegrate. The Gallic warriors fought with suicidal ferocity. They knew this was their singular final chance to break the Roman chokehold and save their civilization. Under the crushing weight of the dual assault, the Roman northwestern camp began to buckle. Caesar immediately dispatched his lieutenant Labienus with 6 cohorts to reinforce the failing line. He then personally rode to the front, rallying the exhausted infantry to hold the sector. Realizing the northwest was heavily defended, Vercingetorix violently pivoted, throwing his men at the lightly defended southern wall. Braving a storm of arrows, the Gauls used iron hooks to rip the Roman palisades apart. In a desperate countermeasure, Caesar deployed Brutus and Fabius with 13 cohorts to plug the breach. The 2 armies engaged in a horrific grinding slaughter on top of the ruined wall. The southern line was bleeding out, the northwest was on the verge of collapse, and Caesar had no infantry left. Facing total annihilation, he made a final, blindingly aggressive gamble. He took his last reserve, the Germanic cavalry, and ordered them out of the camp. They rode quietly along the northern ravine, executing a massive flanking maneuver to strike the rear of the 60,000 elite Gauls attacking Mount Rhea. Meanwhile, Caesar stabilized the southern wall, threw on his iconic crimson cloak, and personally led 4 infantry cohorts and the remaining cavalry in a desperate head-on charge to support Labienus in the northwest. "Gaul falls today," Caesar roared over the chaos. Seeing their supreme commander throw himself into the bloodbath, the Roman infantry surged with a terrifying, violent energy. At that exact moment, the Germanic cavalry erupted from the rear of Mount Rhea, driving their lances into the back of the 60,000 Gallic elites. Caught between the Roman infantry and the Germanic cavalry, the Gallic elite instantly collapsed and routed. From their outer camp, the remaining 200,000 Gallic reserves watched their vanguard get slaughtered. Their morale shattered. The entire relief force disintegrated into a chaotic, panicked retreat. The Germanic cavalry hunted them down, cutting them to pieces from behind. The massive relief army of 250,000 men was completely destroyed. Inside Alesia, Vercingetorix watched his last hope evaporate. He gathered the surviving defenders and calmly accepted reality. I did not lead this war for myself, but for the freedom of all Gaul. The gods have decided our fate. I offer you my life. Kill me and present my head to Caesar, or hand me over alive. Do whatever it takes to save yourselves. Ultimately, Vercingetorix donned his ceremonial armor, rode his horse alone out of the gates, and threw his weapons at Caesar's feet. The siege of Alesia stands as one of the most brilliant and terrifying military engagements in human history. Through unmatched logistical engineering, ruthless decision-making, and his iron grip over his men, Caesar's 60,000 soldiers had survived a simultaneous assault from 80,000 men inside the walls and 250,000 men on the outside. Vercingetorix had lost, but he had achieved the impossible, unifying the deeply fractured tribes of Gaul. Using scorched earth tactics and guerrilla warfare, he had repeatedly pushed Caesar to the brink of destruction. He was a brilliant, highly capable leader, but ultimately tribal courage and massed numbers could not defeat the industrialized, hyper-professional slaughter of the Roman legions. After Alesia, the Gallic resistance was permanently broken. Over the next 2 years, Caesar systematically exterminated the remaining holdouts. After 9 years of blood and iron, the entirety of Gaul had been ground into a Roman province. In the winter of 51 BC, Caesar handed operational control of Gaul to his lieutenant Labienus and returned to his headquarters in Ravenna to manage his political survival. Gold and sand, the ambition of Crassus and the tragedy of Carrhae. While Julius Caesar was conquering Gaul and building an unmatched military reputation, the political balance in Rome was quietly fracturing. But to understand how that political balance was destroyed, we have to rewind the timeline to 55 BC, while Caesar was still fighting his early campaigns. We have to look at the third pillar of the first triumvirate, the richest man in Rome, Marcus Licinius Crassus. In a Roman society where supreme political authority was paid for in blood and military glory, Crassus felt inadequate. He possessed unimaginable wealth and had crushed the Spartacus rebellion, but that paled in comparison to Pompey's conquest of the East and Caesar's brutal annexation of Gaul. To stand as an equal among his allies, Crassus desperately needed a monumental foreign conquest. He set his sights on Rome's powerful eastern neighbor, the Parthian Empire. At the time, Parthia stood alongside Rome, the Kushan Empire, and Han China as one of the 4 great superpowers spanning Eurasia. Crassus made a cold, pragmatic calculation. If he could strip Parthia of its massive territories or completely destroy the empire, he would secure an immortal legacy and instantly eclipse both Caesar and Pompey. 2 factors fueled this massive ambition. First, ever since the Marian reforms, the Roman legions had been virtually invincible. They had crushed rebellions, wiped out pirates, and conquered Gaul and Asia Minor. Their combat effectiveness terrified neighboring nations. Second, Parthia was sinking into a political swamp. In 57 BC, the Parthian emperor Phraates III was poisoned by his 2 sons, Orodes and Mithridates. The brothers immediately turned on each other, triggering a vicious civil war. Crassus firmly believed the Parthian Empire was exhausted and ripe for conquest. Before Crassus ever reached Syria, the local Roman governor, Gabinius, had actually planned to intervene in this Parthian civil war to install a pro-Roman puppet. But when an uprising erupted in Egypt, King Ptolemy XII, the father of the future Cleopatra, begged Rome for emergency assistance. Gabinius was ordered to intervene in Egypt, and the invasion of Parthia was shelved. In late 55 BC, Crassus officially took command as the governor of Syria. Using his bottomless personal fortune, he illegally raised 7 veteran legions, backed by 4,000 regular cavalry and over 1,000 elite Gallic horsemen. He commanded a total force of roughly 40,000 men. Notably, the Gallic cavalry was commanded by his own son Publius Crassus. Publius had spent years fighting under Caesar in Gaul, earning significant military prestige, and had been recalled by his father to spearhead the Eastern Front. After a year of preparation, in 53 BC, the Roman and Parthian armies stood at the brink of war. By this time, the Parthian emperor Orodes II had completely secured his throne and heavily scouted Crassus's movements. Orodes struck first diplomatically, sending an envoy with a sharp ultimatum. If this expedition is the will of Rome, Parthia will fight to the bitter end. But if this is merely the private venture of an old man seeking personal profit, we will show you mercy. Crassus arrogantly sneered at the warning, replying, "I will give you my answer in Seleucia." That response was a formal declaration of war. On the eve of the invasion, King Artavasdes II of Armenia arrived at the Roman camp. He offered Crassus a highly strategic proposition. He advised the Roman army to march east through the foothills of the Armenian mountains. The rugged terrain would completely neutralize the mobility of the Parthian cavalry, and the king promised to supply an additional 16,000 cavalry and 30,000 infantry to support the campaign. But Crassus was overconfident and impatient. He rejected the massive reinforcements, refusing to take the longer route. Instead, he chose to march his army straight across the barren deserts of southern Mesopotamia, aiming directly for the Parthian heartland. On the opposing side, Emperor Orodes II demonstrated brilliant strategic vision. He personally led his main infantry and a small cavalry detachment north to invade Armenia, successfully pinning down King Artavasdes. Simultaneously, he dispatched his top commander, Surena, with 10,000 elite cavalry to the southern front. Surena's explicit orders were to intercept, delay, and bleed the Roman army. Surena was the mastermind who had won the civil war and placed Orodes on the throne. In the summer of 53 BC, Crassus crossed the Euphrates River. He hired a local tribal chief named Ariamnes to act as his guide. Ariamnes had previously served under Pompey, but he had secretly defected to the Parthians. Blind to the betrayal, Crassus allowed the traitor to lead his 40,000 men deep into a desolate, waterless wasteland. Near the town of Carrhae, the Roman legions walked directly into Surena's trap. Before the battle began, Crassus's deputy, Cassius, strongly advised deploying the legions in a traditional wide frontal line, with infantry in the center and cavalry protecting the flanks. But Crassus hesitated. Paralyzed by indecision, he ordered his army to form a massive, hollow square. Each side of the square was densely packed with 12 infantry cohorts. While this formation protected them from being flanked, it completely stripped the Roman army of its tactical mobility. As the two armies closed in, the Roman generals urged Crassus to camp by a nearby stream for the night and launch a coordinated offensive the next morning. But young Publius was eager for glory, and Crassus backed his son's aggression, ordering the exhausted, thirsty legions to fight immediately. The Parthian heavy cavalry, the cataphracts, executed a devastating psychological strike. As they approached the Roman lines, the riders kept their heavy iron armor wrapped in rough cloaks, looking like standard light cavalry. At the last second, they ripped off the cloaks, exposing a blinding wall of heavy armor designed to shatter Roman morale. But the real slaughter was delivered by the massive Parthian horse archer divisions. These highly mobile riders fanned out around the Roman flanks, using their speed to stay entirely out of melee range. Then the arrows fell like a plague of locusts. The Roman infantry was forced to raise their shields, locking together into the tight testudo or tortoise formation. However, the Parthians were firing powerful composite bows. The heavy arrows easily punched through the wooden shields, pinning the Roman soldiers' arms to their armor. The battlefield was quickly blanketed in Roman dead. Crassus attempted to counterattack, but he was trapped in a tactical death spiral. He had brought almost no archers of his own, leaving him with zero ranged firepower. If he sent his heavy infantry out to fight, the foot soldiers couldn't catch the horses, completely neutralizing their close quarters lethality. Worse, Surena had solved the fundamental problem of archery warfare. He stationed a massive herd of supply camels in the rear, carrying thousands of bundles of arrows. Whenever a horse archer emptied his quiver, he simply rode to the rear, reloaded, and returned to the firing line. The Parthians could bombard the paralyzed Roman square indefinitely, slowly shooting them to pieces. Desperate to break the slaughter, Crassus ordered his son Publius to lead a breakout force. Publius took 1,300 Gallic cavalry, 500 archers, and a block of elite infantry, roughly 6,000 men, and charged the archers. Seeing the charge, the Parthian horsemen executed a classic nomadic feigned retreat. Eager for a kill, Publius took the bait. He chased them far beyond the protective range of the main Roman army. Once Publius was isolated, the hidden Parthian heavy cavalry suddenly attacked his front, while the retreating horse archers wheeled around and encircled his flanks. Trapped in a pocket of death, the Roman detachment fought brutally. The Gallic cavalry displayed terrifying physical courage. Knowing their weapons could not pierce the heavy Parthian armor, the Gauls leaped from their horses, physically tackling the cataphracts to the ground, or crawled under the enemy horses to stab them in the belly. But flesh and blood could not overcome an overwhelming tactical disadvantage. Publius and his surviving men were pushed onto an isolated hill. To avoid the humiliation of being captured alive, Publius and his officers committed suicide in the dirt. After exterminating the breakout force, the Parthians cut off Publius's head, mounted it on a spear, and rode back to the main Roman square. They resumed the arrow barrage, inflicting horrific casualties until the sun finally set. Because the Parthians rarely fought at night, Surena ordered his men to pull back, giving the bleeding Roman legions a brief moment to breathe. That night, Crassus suffered a total psychological collapse. Paralyzed by panic, he made a cold, brutal decision. He abandoned over 4,000 severely wounded Roman soldiers in the camp and fled through the darkness toward the city of Carrhae with his surviving forces. The next morning, Surena's army swept into the abandoned Roman camp, slaughtered every single wounded soldier, and surrounded the city. With his army trapped inside Carrhae, Surena offered Crassus a parley. The terms were absolute. Rome had to unconditionally surrender all territory east of the Euphrates River. When the Roman soldiers heard the terms, the fear of death finally broke their discipline. They mutinied. Surrounding Crassus's tent, they drew their weapons and delivered an ultimatum. If you do not go to this parley with dignity, we will help you go. Cornered by his own men, Crassus took a small detail of guards and rode out to meet Surena. The negotiation was a trap. As the commanders dismounted, a violent physical altercation broke out. In the ensuing chaos, Crassus was killed. A deeply ironic legend surrounds his aftermath. To mock the Roman billionaire's endless, obsessive greed, the Parthians allegedly poured molten gold down his throat. The Battle of Carrhae was a cataclysmic disaster for the Roman Republic. Out of 40,000 men, 20,000 were killed in the desert, and nearly 10,000 were dragged away as slaves. Only a fractured remnant of 10,000 men managed to escape back to Syria under the command of Cassius. The geopolitical shock waves of Carrhae were massive. Rome's eastward expansion was permanently halted. More fatally, the death of Crassus completely shattered the first triumvirate. The political tripod that had forced stability onto Rome collapsed, guaranteeing a massive, catastrophic civil war between Caesar and Pompey. On the other side of the battlefield, Emperor Orodes II secured a total victory over Armenia. But the man who actually won the Battle of Carrhae, the brilliant commander Surena, did not survive his own success. Strategically, Orodes had likely given Surena just 10,000 cavalry simply to delay Crassus and keep him out of Armenia. He never expected a screening force to annihilate the main Roman army. But fate intervened. Crassus had marched a massive army of heavy infantry into the desert without archers. Without ranged firepower, the Roman legions were reduced to target practice. Surena expertly exploited this fatal flaw, wiping out a Roman army 4 times his size, killing a Roman head of state and capturing the sacred legionary eagles. But the victory was too bright. To Emperor Orodes, a general who could annihilate 40,000 elite Romans with a fraction of the men, was a direct threat to the throne. Shortly after delivering one of the greatest military victories in Parthian history, the legendary commander Surena was executed by his own paranoid emperor. The desert sands buried the bones at Carrhae, but the power vacuum left in the wake of the slaughter would soon drag the Roman Republic into the abyss of total civil war. The outbreak of the Roman Civil War, from the Rubicon to the siege of Dyrrhachium. By 51 BC, the Gallic Wars were effectively over. Only a few minor uprisings remained, posing no real threat to Roman control. But Caesar was not looking at Gaul. His eyes were fixed on the gathering storm in Rome. The patrician faction in the Senate had been waiting for years to destroy him. Illegal conscription, launching unauthorized wars. These were fatal charges that would guarantee his execution or exile. Caesar knew the exact political math. The second his term as governor expired and he lost his legal immunity, he was a dead man. To protect himself, he used the staggering wealth he plundered from Gaul to buy a tribune named Curio, a politician who originally belonged to the patrician faction. Whenever the Senate introduced a bill to strip Caesar of his command, Curio immediately vetoed it. He publicly countered with a flawless political trap. If Caesar must surrender his legions, then Pompey, who the Senate has embraced, must surrender his legions simultaneously. Anything else is tyranny. Curio knew Pompey's ego would never accept those terms. Armed with the tribune's ultimate veto power, Curio completely paralyzed the patrician faction. On December 9th, 50 BC, with only 8 days left in Curio's term, the consul Marcellus attempted once again to strip Caesar of his command. Curio vetoed it. Furious, Marcellus dissolved the Senate session, bitterly declaring, "If you continue to compromise like this, Caesar will soon be the master of the state." The next day, Marcellus took extreme action. He stood before the Senate and claimed he had intercepted intelligence proving Caesar was marching 10 legions across the Alps to attack Rome. Curio immediately exposed the claim as a lie, but the psychological damage was done. The rumor triggered the Senate's deepest trauma. 30 years ago, Marius and Sulla had repeatedly marched armies into Rome, slaughtering the political elite. Driven by blind panic, the previously hesitant senators finally united in absolute opposition to Caesar. Seizing the momentum, Marcellus visited Pompey, who had been quietly watching from the sidelines. Marcellus begged him, "To save the Republic, you must stop Caesar. We are granting you supreme command over all military operations." This political collapse cornered Caesar at his headquarters in Ravenna. He ordered the 8th, 12th, and 13th legions stationed in Gaul to urgently march south, while making one final attempt at diplomacy. But the Senate issued the Senatus Consultum Ultimum, the ultimate decree. They ordered Caesar to immediately surrender his command and return to Rome as a private citizen. If he refused, he would be declared an enemy of the state, and any citizen could legally kill him. Diplomacy was dead. The fate of the Republic would be decided by iron. Looking at the geopolitical board, Pompey did not have a clear political platform, nor did he possess a tightly organized faction like Caesar. Pompey was chosen as the figurehead of the aristocracy simply because of his legendary military record and massive public prestige. Driven by vanity and flattered by the Senate, Pompey anointed himself the savior of the Republic. On paper, he was the supreme commander of Rome. In reality, he was a military pawn being used by the patricians to destroy Caesar. On January 10th, 49 BC, Caesar arrived at the banks of the Rubicon River with the 13th Legion. Roman law strictly forbade any provincial governor from leading an army across this river. Crossing it was an act of high treason. Sitting on his horse, looking at the water, Caesar spoke to his staff. "To cross this river will bring tragedy to the world. To not cross it will bring destruction to myself." He paused. The die is cast. When Caesar crossed the Rubicon, he had exactly 1 understrength legion. 2 more were marching from Gaul, and the remaining 6 were holding his northern territories. In contrast, Pompey and the Senate possessed total legal legitimacy. They controlled the armies, navies, and treasuries of Spain, North Africa, Italy, Greece, Asia Minor, Egypt, and Syria. Caesar was massively outnumbered, but he held one critical advantage. His men had spent a decade fighting shoulder to shoulder in the mud of Gaul. They were a hyper-lethal, battle-hardened brotherhood. Pompey's forces were vast, but they were scattered across continents, softened by years of peace. To Caesar's surprise, as he marched south, the Italian cities did not resist. Instead, the civilians threw open their gates and welcomed his army. Pompey, meanwhile, realized a terrifying truth. He only had 2 legions immediately available in Italy, and both had originally belonged to Caesar. Pompey had no idea if they would actually fight their former commander. Because of this, on January 17th, Pompey made a decision that shocked the ancient world. He abandoned Rome. He ordered the entire Senate and his loyalists to evacuate south. The exodus was so massive that every transport wagon in the city was requisitioned. The capital of the empire was left completely empty. Caesar did not stop to occupy Rome. He relentlessly pursued Pompey south, absorbing defecting enemy garrisons along the way. His army snowballed in size. In mid-February, a Pompeian general named Domitius attempted to stall Caesar at Corfinium with 3 newly raised legions. Domitius sent a desperate plea to Pompey for reinforcements. Pompey's reply was ice cold. Your stand does not align with my grand strategy. You made this decision alone, and you will receive no reinforcements. Realizing he was trapped, Domitius attempted to sneak out of the camp in the dead of night. His own soldiers caught him, tied him up, and handed him directly to Caesar. In any standard civil war, Caesar would have executed Domitius and his officers. Instead, Caesar treated them with deep respect and unconditionally released them. This act of clemency sent shockwaves through the Roman political class. Even Cicero, who was stationed in Pompey's camp, noted the devastating optics. Caesar looked like a merciful statesman, while Pompey looked like a coward abandoning his own men. When Caesar heard of Cicero's comments, he replied, "I am deeply moved by your praise. I do not intend to be cruel. Even if those I forgive turn their spears against me tomorrow, I will not regret it. I only ask that others act with the same transparency." By March, Pompey and his followers reached the southern port of Brundisium, preparing to evacuate across the sea to Greece. Caesar force-marched his men to the coast, but he had no navy. He attempted to build massive earthworks to blockade the harbor, but Pompey, a master of logistics, executed a flawless withdrawal under heavy defense. Standing on the shoreline, watching Pompey's fleet disappear over the horizon, Caesar realized this would not be a quick victory. It would be a sprawling, brutal war of attrition. With Pompey abandoning Italy, Sardinia and Sicily immediately defected to Caesar. To secure his rear, Caesar pivoted west that summer, marching directly into Pompey's traditional stronghold, Spain. 7 elite Pompeian legions were stationed there. In a brilliant campaign of maneuver warfare at Ilerda, Caesar defeated Pompey's top lieutenants and forced 5 legions to surrender. When the news reached the remaining 2 legions in Gades, they mutinied and declared for Caesar. Without fighting a major pitched battle, Caesar absorbed the entire province of Spain. The western front was secure, though Caesar suffered losses elsewhere. His close friend Curio was killed fighting in North Africa, and his forces in Illyria were destroyed by Pompey's navy. But the strategic objective was achieved. In December, Caesar returned to Rome and was formally appointed dictator. In just 11 days, he passed a series of debt relief laws to stabilize the economy and secure public loyalty. He then resigned the dictatorship and legally won the election for consul. Through this brilliant political maneuvering, Caesar washed away the label of enemy of the state and became the legal head of the Roman government. With his rear secure and his legitimacy restored, he was ready to cross the sea and hunt Pompey down. On January 4th, 48 BC, in the dead of winter, Caesar made his move. Lacking sufficient transport ships, he split his forces. Under the cover of night, he slipped through the naval blockade with 15,000 elite infantry, successfully landing on the Greek coast at Palayest. He immediately marched north toward Pompey's critical supply hub, Dyrrachium. The transport ships turned back to Italy to ferry the remaining 15,000 men, commanded by Mark Antony. But the man commanding the naval blockade was Bibulus, the very same patrician Caesar had humiliated and locked in his house a decade earlier. 10 years later, they met again. Driven by vengeance, Bibulus tightened his grip on the coast, completely severing Caesar's supply lines. To ensure Antony's reinforcements never crossed, Bibulus refused to leave his ship, sleeping on the freezing, violently pitching deck, swearing to destroy any vessel that tried to cross. On land, Caesar advanced north almost unopposed. Hearing that the conqueror of Gaul and Spain had arrived, the coastal Greek cities opened their gates, openly supplying Caesar right in front of Pompey's garrisons. In less than a week, Caesar established a solid foothold on the eastern coast of the Adriatic. Deep in Macedonia, Pompey received the intelligence. He force-marched his massive army day and night, arriving at the strategic stronghold of Dyrrhachium just before Caesar. Heavily outnumbered, Caesar was forced to camp across the Apsus River, locking the two armies in a standoff. Caesar was strategically paralyzed. Pompey's massive army blocked the land, and Bibulus's fleet blocked the sea. Everything depended on Mark Antony breaking the blockade. But while Bibulus was starving Caesar, the blockade was killing Bibulus. Because the coastal cities had defected to Caesar, the Roman fleet could not dock to secure fresh water. Exhausted by the freezing winter and severe dehydration, Bibulus died on his ship. With the blockade weakened, a strong southern wind carried Antony's fleet across the sea. He landed safely in Greece. Pompey had missed his best chance to crush Caesar while he was isolated. To prevent the two forces from merging, Pompey set an ambush near Tirana. But local Greeks loyal to Caesar leaked the plan to Antony. Antony immediately fortified his position and sent riders to Caesar. The next day, Pompey realized Caesar's main force had marched around him and was closing in. To avoid being crushed between Caesar and Antony, Pompey abandoned the ambush and retreated south to Asparagium to wait for massive reinforcements arriving from Syria under his father-in-law, Metellus Scipio. From this moment on, the two greatest commanders of their age used the sprawling geography of Greece as a chessboard, executing a relentless game of strategic envelopment. Now reinforced, Caesar repeatedly offered battle. Pompey refused, leveraging his high ground and secure supply lines. Frustrated, Caesar executed a rapid flanking maneuver through the rugged mountains, arriving at the high ground south of Dyrrhachium before Pompey. He successfully severed Pompey's land connection to the city. When Pompey arrived, he could only stare at the massive grain silos of Dyrrhachium from a distance. However, Pompey still controlled the sea. His transport ships kept his massive army fed. The situation was incredibly volatile. Caesar's camp was squeezed between the mountains and the river. If Pompey used his numerical advantage to counter-encircle him, Caesar would be destroyed. Pompey was planning exactly that, but Caesar moved first. Caesar decided to replicate the engineering nightmare of Alesia. He ordered his men to chop down forests and dig trenches, constructing 26 massive forts along the ridges, connecting them with miles of palisades. His objective was insane. He was building a wall to physically lock a much larger army against the sea, cutting them off from inland water and forage. Realizing what was happening, Pompey did not attempt a brute force breakout. He ordered his men to dig. Caesar built walls to trap Pompey. Pompey built walls to push back. With a massive numerical advantage, Pompey's engineering outpaced Caesar's. Pompey aggressively expanded his inner perimeter, securing hills that held fresh water and grass, which forced Caesar to stretch his outer wall even further. This psychotic engineering race dragged on until both lines hit a river to the south. Ultimately, Caesar had constructed a semicircular siege wall stretching 15 miles. From late spring into the scorching summer, the two largest armies in the Roman world sat trapped in this claustrophobic maze of trenches and redoubts. Even though Pompey was well supplied by sea, being trapped on a beach by a smaller army was a humiliating political disaster. Rumors spread through his camp that he was losing his nerve. To break the stalemate, Pompey initiated psychological warfare. He planted a rumor that traitors inside Actium were willing to open the gates to Caesar. Starving from the endless siege, Caesar took the bait. On June 25th, Caesar led an elite detachment toward the city. The moment he approached the walls, Pompey triggered the trap. A massive Pompeian force attacked Caesar's lines from 6 different directions simultaneously. Relying on their heavily fortified redoubts and veteran discipline, Caesar's men barely held the line, fighting for 4 hours before driving Pompey back. Pompey failed, but another opportunity quickly materialized. 2 corrupt cavalry commanders in Caesar's camp, fearing punishment for embezzling wages, defected to Pompey in the middle of the night. They brought the ultimate prize, the exact defensive blueprints of Caesar's 15-mile wall. They revealed a fatal flaw at the extreme southern end of the perimeter near the sea. The engineering was so massive that the Romans hadn't finished the wall there. A huge gap was wide open. On the night of July 6th, a thrilled Pompey mobilized 60 cohorts, his absolute core strength, and launched a devastating amphibious and overland assault on the unfinished southern gap. The 9th Legion defending the sector was caught completely off guard. The line shattered instantly. Almost every Roman officer in that sector was killed. Only a single centurion survived the slaughter. Just as the 9th Legion was about to be annihilated, Mark Antony arrived with 12 cohorts, barely stabilizing the collapse. Pompey knew the value of momentum. He didn't waste time grinding against Antony. His objective was clear: break out of the encirclement, seize the southern high ground, and build a new camp to permanently secure a land route to the southern cities. When Caesar arrived with the main force, he desperately tried to plug the gap while launching a counterattack to sever Pompey's new supply line. But Pompey had broken out of the trenches. On the open terrain, his massive numerical advantage was overwhelming. Caesar's counterattack was brutally repulsed. To push further meant certain slaughter. The grand siege of Actium had failed. Pompey won the Battle of Actium. He aggressively broadcast the victory across the Roman world, dealing a massive blow to Caesar's political prestige. The momentum of the war had completely shifted. If Pompey simply boarded his ships, sailed back to an empty Italy, and reclaimed Rome, the political narrative would force dozens of defected cities back into his hands. Caesar knew he was staring at total defeat. He had to violently change the geometry of the war. Facing annihilation, Caesar made a massive strategic gamble. He would use a highly mobile feint to drag Pompey away from the coast and into the open plains. On July 9th, Caesar abandoned his positions at Actium and force-marched his army east, deep into the heart of Macedonia. On paper, he was moving to intercept the massive reinforcements arriving from Syria under Pompey's father-in-law, Metellus Scipio. In reality, he was baiting Pompey to leave the safety of the sea. Forced to choose between reclaiming Rome or saving his father-in-law's army, Pompey took the bait. Caesar won the gamble. On July 24th, Caesar's army linked up with another of his legions in Thessaly, boosting his total strength to roughly 24,000 men. Meanwhile, Pompey tracked him overland. On August 1st, Pompey merged his forces with Metellus Scipio at Larissa. The combined army exploded in size, swelling to over 40,000 men. Command unified, Pompey marched this massive juggernaut south, heading straight for Caesar. After 6 months of strategic starvation, psychological warfare, and brutal trench combat, the 2 titans of the age finally stood facing each other on the open plains of Pharsalus, ready to decide the ultimate fate of the Roman Republic. the turning point of the Roman civil war, Pharsalus, and the death of Pompey. In 49 BC, the Roman civil war erupted across the Mediterranean. The patrician faction's champion, Pompey, and the populist leader, Caesar, were locked in a brutal geopolitical chess match. From Italy to Spain, and from Spain to Greece, the two greatest commanders of the Republic hunted each other, trading victories and defeats. In July of 48 BC, Pompey leveraged his massive numerical advantage and naval supremacy to break Caesar's siege at Actium, inflicting heavy casualties on Caesar's legions. The Senate immediately capitalized on the victory. Patrician propaganda flooded the empire, declaring that Pompey's ultimate triumph was inevitable. The narrative was highly effective, causing several cities that had recently defected to Caesar to panic and realign with Pompey. Caesar was trapped in a nightmare. He had lost the ground war, his sea routes were blockaded, and his army was starving. However, the opportunity to break the stalemate arrived with Pompey's father-in-law, Metellus Scipio. Metellus had just landed in Greece with massive reinforcements from Syria. Caesar seized the intelligence and executed a strategic gamble. He marched his starving army east, creating the illusion that he was moving to intercept Metellus. In reality, he was baiting Pompey to abandon his heavily fortified, fully supplied stronghold at Actium. Inside Pompey's camp, several senators aggressively pushed to ignore Caesar. They demanded Pompey sail back to Italy, reclaim an undefended Rome, and declare total victory. But Pompey refused. He would not abandon his father-in-law's army, nor would he abandon his elite Greek allies. He chose pursuit. On August 1st, 48 BC, Pompey successfully merged his forces with Metellus at Larissa. Command unified, the massive army marched south, pushing into the plains of Thessaly, aiming directly for Caesar. The plains of Pharsalus offered a massive, flat expanse surrounded by rolling hills, split by the Enipeus River. Both commanders anchored their camps on the southern bank and prepared for a decisive engagement. Before a single sword was drawn, Pompey's command tent was tearing itself apart. The patrician senators and generals were not debating tactics. They were arguing over how to divide Caesar's estate, who would become the next praetor, and who would claim the title of Pontifex Maximus. Drunk on their recent victory, the senators openly mocked Pompey's cautious defensive strategy, labeling him a coward. The slander grew vicious. Some senators whispered, "Pompey isn't delaying the war for strategy. He's dragging it out because he loves treating the Senate like his servants." The political pressure on Pompey was crushing. His own generals were demanding an immediate attack. Meanwhile, Caesar was changing his tactics. Operating right under Pompey's nose, Caesar mobilized his army almost daily, shifting his camp and constantly probing for a weakness. Exhausted by the internal badgering and provoked by Caesar's maneuvers, Pompey finally abandoned his defensive strategy. He ordered his army onto the plains. The numerical disparity was staggering. Caesar fielded roughly 22,000 infantry and just 1,000 cavalry, totaling around 30,000 men with auxiliaries. Pompey commanded 47,000 infantry, 4,000 archers and slingers, and 7,000 cavalry. His total force was double the size of Caesar's. While Pompey's army was a fractured coalition of provincial troops lacking cohesion, the sheer 2-to-1 advantage gave him unshakable confidence. To maximize the shock value of his cavalry on the flat terrain, Pompey concentrated all 7,000 of his elite horsemen on his left wing, supported by archers and slingers. He handed command of this massive strike force to Labienus. Labienus had been Caesar's most trusted and brilliant lieutenant during the Gallic Wars, but had defected to Pompey when the civil war broke out. Pompey anchored his heavy infantry to the right of the cavalry, commanded by Domitius, Metellus, and Lentulus. Caesar mirrored the deployment. His infantry was commanded by Antony, Calvinus, and Sulla, the nephew of the former dictator. Facing a 7-to-1 disadvantage in cavalry, Caesar placed his 1,000 horsemen on his right wing to screen his infantry. But Caesar clearly recognized the fatal threat posed by Pompey's massive left wing. Quietly, he pulled his most elite, battle-hardened veterans from the rear of his infantry blocks and formed a hidden fourth line. He stationed them directly behind his own cavalry, specifically to absorb the inevitable flanking maneuver. On August 9th, 48 BC, the battle lines were drawn. Caesar rode across his front, delivering a sharp, visceral speech to his men. Following him, the centurions rallied their cohorts. In the 10th Legion, a centurion named Crastinus caught Caesar's eye. Stepping out of formation, Crastinus saluted his commander and roared, "General, whether I survive this day or not, I swear you will be proud of what I do." The battle cry sent a massive surge of adrenaline through the ranks. The horns blew, and Caesar's 1st and 2nd infantry lines launched a dead sprint toward the enemy. Pompey ordered his men to stand perfectly still. He intended to force Caesar's infantry to cover double the distance, exhausting their stamina before the melee even began. But Pompey underestimated his enemy. Caesar's men had spent a decade fighting in Gaul. Forced marches were muscle memory. Halfway across the killing field, the veteran infantry instinctively stopped. They caught their breath, realigned their formation, blew their horns again, and slammed into Pompey's line. Following Roman doctrine, the two armies exchanged devastating volleys of heavy javelins before drawing their short swords and locking into a brutal, grinding melee. As the infantry slaughtered each other, Pompey triggered his trap. Labienus led the 7,000 cavalry on a massive charge from the left wing, covered by a hail of suppressing fire from the archers and slingers. The impact was immediate. Caesar's 1,000 horsemen were instantly shattered and driven backward. With the cavalry screening gone, Caesar's right flank, the 10th Legion, was completely exposed to the thundering hooves of Pompey's horsemen. Just as Labienus prepared to wheel his cavalry around and envelop the Roman infantry, Caesar gave the signal. The hidden fourth line erupted from the rear. These grizzled veterans did not throw their javelins. Instead, they gripped the heavy iron shafts like spears and marched forward, aiming the iron tips directly at the faces of the riders and the chests of their horses. The tactic was deeply unnatural. Faced with a wall of iron aimed directly at their faces, the pampered aristocratic cavalry panicked and instinctively pulled their reins. The momentum of the charge violently stalled. While the cavalry hesitated in confusion, Caesar's veterans pushed into their ranks. Javelins pierced the chests of the horses and the bodies of the riders. Fear ripped through Pompey's elite cavalry, triggering a catastrophic collapse in morale. The massive cavalry force completely routed, abandoning the archers and fleeing the battlefield in terror. Stripped of their cavalry protection, Pompey's archers and slingers were defenseless. They were butchered by Caesar's veterans. Caesar then ordered the fourth line to push forward. Coordinating with the front-line infantry, they enveloped Pompey's left wing from 3 directions in a fatal pincer movement. The collapse of the cavalry had already shattered the morale of Pompey's infantry. Under the crushing pressure of Caesar's flanking maneuver, they began to waver. Seeing the critical moment, Caesar deployed his fresh, unengaged third-line reserves, driving them like a wedge into the exhausted front line. Slammed by fresh, hyper-lethal veterans, Pompey's exhausted left wing completely broke. The line ruptured, and thousands of men dropped their weapons and fled. Watching his entire army disintegrate, Pompey lost his nerve. He abandoned his troops, took his closest advisors, and fled toward Larissa. With their supreme commander gone, the Pompeian army collapsed into a total rout. Caesar aggressively pursued the fleeing soldiers, stormed Pompey's fortified camp, and secured a decisive, world-altering victory. When Caesar walked into Pompey's command tent, the sight was staggering. The patrician quarters were lavishly decorated. Silver plates were piled with exquisite food, and the tents were adorned with ivy. It was clear that the aristocratic elite had not prepared for a bloodbath. They had prepared a victory banquet. At the Battle of Pharsalus, Caesar lost roughly 1,000 men and 30 centurions, including Crestinus, the man who had sworn the oath before the battle. Pompey lost over 6,000 dead, and 24,000 men were taken prisoner. Following the defeat, Pompey's political coalition shattered. Marcus Brutus was captured and surrendered to Caesar. The former consul Marcellus retired in Greece. Cicero and Varro accepted reality and returned to Italy. Metellus and Labienus fled to North Africa to rebuild an army, while Cato the Younger led a faction south to find Pompey. Pompey was left with barely 30 loyal followers. He originally planned to flee east to Syria to rebuild his forces, knowing the eastern provinces held massive wealth and manpower reserves. But the governors of Rhodes and Cyprus had already heard the news of Pharsalus. They explicitly barred Pompey's ships from docking, completely closing off the route to Syria. Out of options, Pompey turned to his final sanctuary, Egypt. 7 years earlier, in 55 BC, Egypt had suffered a rebellion. Acting on Pompey's orders, the Roman governor Gabinius had marched into Egypt, restored King Ptolemy XII to the throne, and left a Roman legion to guard the capital of Alexandria. Pompey believed that this massive political debt guaranteed him safe harbor, but Ptolemy XII had died 3 years earlier. His will dictated that Egypt be jointly ruled by his daughter, Cleopatra VII, and his son, Ptolemy XIII, as husband and wife. The siblings had already fractured into a bitter civil war over sole dominion. The young boy, Ptolemy XIII, controlled the capital, while Cleopatra was forced into exile on the Syrian border, raising a mercenary army to take back the throne. When Pompey sent a desperate letter to the Egyptian court requesting asylum, the ministers erupted in debate. The real power behind the boy king rested in the hands of the eunuch Pothinus and the chief minister Theodotus. Theodotus laid out a cold, pragmatic analysis. If we accept Pompey, his prestige and surviving loyalists will allow him to hijack Egypt, dragging us into a war with a victorious Caesar. If we reject him outright, we make a powerful enemy. Since war between Caesar and Pompey is inevitable, we should simply kill Pompey and hand his head to Caesar. We eliminate a threat and win Caesar's favor. Dead men don't bite. On September 28th, 48 BC, Pompey's ship anchored off the coast of Alexandria, waiting for clearance to enter the harbor. An Egyptian skiff rowed out to meet him. Sitting in the small boat was Septimius, a former Roman officer who had once served under Pompey. Septimius delivered a message. The king was waiting on the shore, but the water was too shallow for the large ship. Pompey was asked to transfer to the skiff, while his family and soldiers would be brought in later. The deliberate isolation was an obvious red flag, but Pompey had no choice. He boarded the skiff with the former consul Lentulus and a few attendants, leaving his wife, his son, and his soldiers waiting on the ship. The skiff rowed toward the shore in dead silence. The moment Pompey stood up to step onto the beach, the trap snapped shut. Egyptian soldiers pinned his arms from behind, and his former officer, Septimius, drove a dagger into his chest. Watching the assassination from the deck of the ship, Pompey's family screamed in horror. The crew instantly raised the sails and fled the waters. The man who had dominated global politics for decades, the conqueror revered as Pompey the Great, was brutally and humiliatingly butchered on a foreign beach. 4 days later, Caesar arrived at the port of Alexandria with just over 4,000 elite infantry. Egyptian envoys immediately presented him with a box containing Pompey's severed head. They subtly delivered the political message. Since Caesar had received the ultimate prize, they expected him to take the head and leave Egypt immediately. When Caesar opened the box and saw the face of his former son-in-law, his old political ally, and the greatest rival of his life, he did not celebrate. Instead, he broke down and wept in public. But the Roman consul's grief rapidly calcified into violent rage. To Caesar, this was not a matter of personal vengeance. It was a catastrophic violation of state dignity. Egypt was an allied client state of Rome, and Pompey had been a legally recognized supreme commander and consul. Even as the leader of a rebel faction in a civil war, a Roman commander could not be butchered like a common thief by foreign conspirators. It was a blatant desecration of the authority of the Roman Republic. Furthermore, Rome relied heavily on Egyptian grain shipments. An unstable, rogue Egyptian government was a direct threat to Roman national security. Driven by these factors, Caesar asserted his authority as a Roman consul and took control of the situation. He issued an uncompromising ruling: the late king's will must be enforced. Ptolemy XIII and Cleopatra VII would rule Egypt together. This ruling was completely unacceptable to Ptolemy XIII and his ministers, who had already seized total power. The eunuch Pothinus secretly ordered the Egyptian general Achilles to march on Alexandria with 20,000 troops to wipe Caesar out. In the midst of this escalating crisis, a highly critical player bypassed the blockades and arrived at Caesar's door. She had herself wrapped inside a luxurious carpet and smuggled into his private quarters. When the carpet unrolled, it revealed the exiled Queen of Egypt, Cleopatra VII. Armed with brilliant intellect and striking charisma, she instantly secured Caesar's political and military backing. Days later, Achilles' massive army arrived at the city gates. Realizing the situation had spiraled out of control, Caesar executed a rapid lockdown. He took the boy king Ptolemy XIII hostage inside the palace and executed the mastermind Pothinus for treason. Caesar then sent desperate requests for reinforcements to Roman garrisons in Asia Minor and neighboring client states, but Achilles held a massive numerical advantage. He quickly trapped Caesar's 4,000 men inside the royal palace complex. The conflict exploded into a horrific, grinding urban bloodbath known as the Alexandrian War. To prevent the Egyptian army from capturing the fleet anchored in the harbor and severing his sea routes, Caesar was forced to order the ships burned. The fire rapidly spread from the docks into the city, engulfing nearby buildings. In the chaos, the Library of Alexandria, the greatest repository of knowledge in the ancient world, caught fire and countless irreplaceable texts were reduced to ash. As the two sides slaughtered each other for control of the streets, the political dynamic fractured again. Princess Arsinoe, Cleopatra's younger sister, managed to escape the palace with the help of a loyalist. She fled to the Egyptian military camp, declared herself the true queen of Egypt, assassinated the general Achilles, and took direct command of the army, continuing the massive siege against Caesar. The brutal urban warfare dragged on for 4 months. It wasn't until heavy Roman reinforcements arrived by land and sea that the tactical balance finally shifted. In February of 47 BC, Ptolemy XIII's forces were completely crushed on the battlefield. While attempting to flee across the Nile River, the young king's overloaded boat capsized, and he drowned in the mud. Princess Arsinoe was captured and imprisoned. Cleopatra VII married her remaining younger brother, formally cementing her supreme authority over Egypt. Aside from the chief minister Theodotus, who managed to flee, and Septimius, who vanished into obscurity, every conspirator involved in Pompey's murder or the siege of the Roman garrison was executed. Caesar had sailed to Egypt simply to hunt down Pompey, only to be dragged into a brutal multi-faction civil war. Over those 8 months, he suppressed the rebellion, secured the grain supply, and fell deeply into a legendary romance with Cleopatra. After years of relentless, grinding warfare, the conqueror finally allowed himself a brief moment of indulgence. But the crisis paralyzing the Roman Empire was far from over. The Republic's politics were still in chaos. The surviving Pompeian faction had raised a massive new army in North Africa, and the remnants of the Pontic kingdom had invaded Asia Minor. These highly volatile geopolitical fires required the immediate attention of the supreme commander. In June of 47 BC, Caesar left the luxury of Egypt. He mobilized his legions and marched out to crush the remaining resistance, intent on consolidating his final grip over the Roman world. The architect of empire, the reforms, and the assassination of Julius Caesar. In 48 BC, following his catastrophic defeat at Pharsalus, Pompey the Great fled to Egypt seeking asylum, only to be butchered by the eunuchs of the Ptolemaic dynasty. Using Pompey's murder as justification, Julius Caesar invaded Egypt, executed the conspirators, and placed a pro-Roman puppet on the throne, Cleopatra VII. With Pompey dead and the Egyptian grain supply secured, Caesar appeared to have won the war. But the Roman civil war was far from over. War is merely an extension of politics, and this conflict was the direct result of 80 years of brutal partisan warfare between the patrician and populist factions, dating back to the Gracchi brothers. Pompey was dead, but the patrician senators who controlled the trajectory of the state were still entrenched across the empire. As the champion of the populists, Caesar knew the civil war would not end until the old aristocratic order was completely eradicated. History proves that the violent campaigns and radical reforms Caesar executed next essentially forced a dying republic onto life support, laying the foundation for a 1,000-year empire. When Pompey was assassinated in September 48 BC, his allied client states in the east were suddenly leaderless. The most aggressive opportunist was King Pharnaces II of the Bosporus, the son of the legendary Mithridates VI. Exploiting Rome's internal chaos, Pharnaces rapidly invaded and annexed Colchis, Armenia, Cappadocia, and parts of Pontus and Bithynia. In December 48 BC, Pharnaces crushed Caesar's lieutenant Domitius at the Battle of Nicopolis, reclaiming the entirety of his father's ancient kingdom and directly threatening the Roman provinces of Asia. The eastern frontier was collapsing. Domitius sent desperate pleas for reinforcements. But Caesar was trapped in the Alexandrian War, entangled in Egyptian politics and Cleopatra's bed. It wasn't until 6 months later that Caesar finally arrived in Antioch with the veteran 6th Legion. Hearing that Caesar had arrived, Pharsalus immediately sent envoys offering submission, attempting to stall for time. Caesar saw right through the diplomatic smokescreen. He noted the arrogance of the envoys and their refusal to stand down their armies. Caesar marched the 6th Legion north and utterly annihilated Pharsalus' army at the Battle of Zela. The victory was so effortless and devastating that Caesar openly mocked his dead rival, stating, "Pompey was incredibly lucky. He built his entire reputation as the Great by fighting this utter garbage." In his official dispatch to the Senate, Caesar summarized the campaign with a phrase that echoed through history. "I came, I saw, I conquered. Veni, vidi, vici." With the East secured, Caesar immediately pivoted to hunt down the remaining patrician resistance. Between December 47 BC and April 46 BC, Caesar launched a lightning campaign into North Africa. At the battles of Ruspina and Thapsus, he systematically dismantled the last major patrician stronghold. Pompey's father-in-law, Metellus Scipio, died fleeing the battlefield. Cato the Younger, the ideological heart of the patrician resistance, realized the war was lost and committed suicide with his own sword. King Juba I of Numidia, who had allied with the Senate, killed himself, and his kingdom was annexed as a new Roman province. The surviving patrician commanders like Labienus and Pompey's son Sextus fled to Spain for a final desperate last stand. Functionally, the entirety of the Roman world was now under Caesar's total control. In August 46 BC, the 54-year-old Caesar finally celebrated his triumph in Rome. Over the past decade, he had conquered Gaul, pacified Egypt, crushed Pontus, and annexed Numidia. To honor his unprecedented military record, Rome threw 4 consecutive triumphs, a spectacle never before seen in the Republic. As Caesar rode his chariot through the streets, towering above massive banners reading, "I came, I saw, I conquered," followed by exotic beasts and royal captives, the city erupted in deafening cheers. But as he looked out over the screaming crowds, Caesar remained cold and calculating. He knew his most critical victory was the utter destruction of Pompey and the patrician faction. But that was a civil war, Romans slaughtering Romans. It was a victory he could not and would not celebrate in a triumph. Caesar didn't just want a partisan victory. He wanted to end the 87 years of political violence that had plagued Rome since the Gracchi brothers. He needed the loyalty of the entire Roman world. The Republic needed a surgical intervention to survive. In 46 BC, Caesar was appointed dictator for 10 years. Facing a fractured, exhausted society, he executed a shocking political strategy. Blanket clemency, he pardoned his former enemies, returned their seized property, and even appointed competent patricians to high government offices. Marcellus, the consul who had literally declared Caesar an enemy of the state, was allowed to return to Rome unharmed. Caesar's ultimate objective was to heal the wounds of the civil war and forcibly reunify the Roman people. With the political opposition neutralized, Caesar exercised his unchecked power to completely overhaul the decaying Roman system. His first target was the demographic foundation of the state. For years, the populations of Cisalpine Gaul had supplied him with manpower and logistics. To solidify this base, Caesar granted them full Roman citizenship, while offering the same rights to any intellectual working as a teacher or doctor in Rome, regardless of their ethnicity or religion. He immediately used this new, diverse power base to cripple the traditional aristocracy. Caesar massively expanded the Senate from 600 to 900 members. He didn't just promote his loyalists, he flooded the chambers with wealthy provincial merchants, veteran centurions, and even the relatives of conquered Gallic chieftains. For centuries, the Senate had been an ultra-exclusive aristocratic club. Flooding it with foreigners inflicted devastating psychological damage on the old patrician elite. By stuffing the Senate with hundreds of conflicting voices who owed their careers entirely to him, Caesar ensured their unquestioning loyalty while turning the institution into a bloated, inefficient rubber stamp committee. Simultaneously, he systematically stripped the tribunes and the citizen assemblies of their independent legislative power, ensuring all political authority radiated exclusively from him. To govern this newly centralized state, Caesar built a massive administrative machine. He redrew the imperial map, divided the empire into 18 provinces, and doubled the number of praetors and quaestors to handle the bureaucratic load. Economically, he eradicated the deeply corrupt private tax farming syndicates, replacing them with a state-run flat tax. He standardized the minting of gold and silver coins, ensuring Roman currency was the uncontested economic lifeblood of the provinces. At the street level, he diffused the ticking time bomb of urban poverty. Decades of war had flooded Rome with unemployed refugees, and the ancient grain dole had become a corrupt tool for politicians to buy votes. Caesar ordered a brutal audit, stripping thousands of fraudulent names off the registry to ensure welfare actually reached the poor. He then launched a massive colonization program, relocating hundreds of thousands of unemployed civilians and retired veterans to overseas provinces. By handing them land, he solved the domestic unemployment crisis while aggressively accelerating the Romanization of the empire. Finally, he synchronized the empire with the sun. Rome was an agricultural superpower relying on a highly inaccurate lunar calendar that was off by 3 entire months. Caesar brought in top astronomers from Egypt and Greece to design a highly accurate solar calendar, the Julian calendar. To honor his legacy, the month of his birth was renamed Julius, what we now call July. Alongside overhauling the judicial system and traffic laws, this relentless barrage of legislation permanently assembled the structural skeleton of the Roman Empire. By 45 BC, the civil war was over. The Senate declared Caesar the father of the fatherland and granted him the unprecedented title of Dictator Perpetuo, dictator for life. Rome began minting gold coins bearing his face. He wore the purple robes of a king and a laurel wreath. Special thrones were built for him in the theaters, and a statue of him was placed alongside the ancient kings of Rome. His cult of personality was bordering on deification. Intoxicated by his power, the Roman crowds began publicly hailing him as Rex, king. Testing the political waters, Caesar publicly replied, "I am not Rex, I am Caesar." In early 44 BC, with his domestic reforms complete, Caesar looked to the borders. 2 massive geopolitical objectives remained. First, he intended to invade Parthia to avenge Crassus and wash away the humiliation of Carrhae. Second, he planned to conquer the territories along the Danube River, establishing hard, natural geographical borders for the empire. He wanted to finish the conquest in his lifetime, securing a permanent peace for future generations. He would never get the chance. His total centralization of power terrified the surviving Republican aristocrats. In February 44 BC, during the festival of Lupercalia, his lieutenant Mark Antony publicly offered Caesar a royal diadem, a crown. Though Caesar loudly rejected it and ordered the refusal recorded in the official archives, the damage was done. paranoia reached critical mass. A prophecy circulated through the city claiming that only a king can conquer Parthia. As the date of his military departure loomed, the whispers of assassination turned into a concrete conspiracy. On the night of March 14th, Caesar dined with his generals Decimus and Lepidus. The conversation turned to mortality, and someone asked what the best kind of death was. Caesar quietly replied, "A sudden one." The next day was March 15th, the Ides of March. Caesar was scheduled to leave for Parthia in 3 days. As usual, he walked into the Senate Hall at the theater of Pompey to conduct government business. The moment he entered the room, the conspirators swarmed him. Under the guise of presenting a petition, they pulled daggers from beneath their togas. Surrounded by dozens of armed men, Caesar was stabbed 23 times. Bleeding out, he pulled his toga over his face and collapsed at the base of a statue of his greatest rival, Pompey. The uncrowned emperor of Rome was dead. Years earlier, when releasing Pompey's captured officers, Caesar had written to Cicero, "Even if those I forgive turn their spears against me tomorrow, I will not regret it. I only ask that others act with the same transparency." His clemency had ultimately cost him his life. Through sheer military genius and ruthless administrative vision, Julius Caesar dismantled a failing republic and built the administrative engine of a global empire. He built the bureaucracy, the tax code, and the welfare state. But because of his sudden assassination, he left behind 3 fatal structural voids. First, how do you establish a legal, peaceful succession of power? Second, how do you control a massive standing army, specifically preventing provincial governors from using their legions to seize the state? Third, how do you force the old aristocracy to accept the new regime? Caesar never lived to answer these questions. But the geopolitical foundation he poured was permanent. The Roman Republic was dead, and the momentum toward an empire was irreversible. The bloody, unfinished business of stabilizing the Roman world would now fall to his heir. As Shakespeare later famously penned for the dying dictator in his final moments, "But I am constant as the northern star, of whose true fixed and resting quality there is no fellow in the firmament." The death of a tyrant and the vacuum of power. On March 15th, 44 BC, the conspirators Marcus Brutus and Cassius Longinus assassinated Julius Caesar. Covered in blood, they rushed into the streets of Rome, screaming to the crowds, "The tyrant is dead. We have our freedom back." The assassins expected the citizens to erupt in joyous celebration, welcoming the return of the Republic. Instead, they were met with dead silence. Terrified by the sudden murder of their dictator, the people of Rome locked their doors and barricaded their homes, waiting to see who would take control. Shortly after Caesar's death, his will was opened. The contents shocked the empire. Caesar named his 18-year-old great-nephew, Octavian, as his primary heir. If he accepted, Octavian would be formally adopted as Caesar's son, inheriting his name and 3/4 of his massive fortune. Furthermore, the will stipulated that every Roman citizen in the capital would receive 300 sesterces. Overnight, the legacy, wealth, and terrifying political gravity of Julius Caesar fell onto the shoulders of an 18-year-old boy. Because Caesar had intended to groom the boy personally, he had sent him to a military camp in Greece to prepare for the Parthian campaign. When the daggers struck in Rome, the heir was miles away across the sea. The will deeply alienated one specific man, Mark Antony. Antony was Caesar's most loyal general, his right-hand man, and he received virtually nothing in the will. Facing a teenager suddenly parachuted into power, Antony was furious. In reality, during the weeks it took Octavian to travel from Greece to Rome, a cold civil war had already begun. The reading of the will threw the patricians, the populists, and the assassins into extreme anxiety. That document represented massive military leverage. Brutus attempted to rally the public in the forum, preaching liberty and the death of tyranny, but the crowds gave him nothing. Their initial passion for Caesar quickly mutated into a paralyzing fear of the unknown. The next day, as the sitting consul, Antony convened the Senate to manage the crisis. The core issue was simple. Were Caesar's laws and appointments still legal? If the Senate officially declared Caesar a tyrant, every law he passed, including the political appointments of half the men sitting in that room, would be instantly voided. More fatally, it would invalidate the land grants given to Caesar's veteran soldiers. Revoking those grants would guarantee that tens of thousands of armed veterans would march on Rome. Ultimately, brokered by the elder statesman Cicero, the Senate reached a tense political compromise. Caesar's laws would remain legal and intact, but the assassins would receive full amnesty. Both sides knew a violent reckoning was inevitable, but no one was ready to fight. With the legal framework settled, Caesar's state funeral proceeded, and Antony made his move. Standing at the rostra, he read Caesar's will aloud to the public, hammering on Caesar's mercy and explicitly highlighting the 300 sesterces promised to every citizen. The crowd was moved to tears. Then, perfectly timing his political theater, Antony hoisted Caesar's blood-soaked, dagger-shredded purple toga for the entire forum to see. Grief instantly violently mutated into rage. A furious mob swarmed the estates of the assassins. Terrified, Brutus, Cassius, and their co-conspirators barricaded themselves inside. Days later, they secretly fled Rome, escaping to the eastern provinces to raise an army. With his enemies out of the capital, Antony moved to secure the military. Leveraging his authority as consul, he recruited Caesar's veterans, specifically targeting the highly experienced centurions. He allied with Lepidus, another of Caesar's former commanders. Together with his brother Gaius, Antony seized the military commands of Transalpine Gaul, Syria, and Macedonia, ordering several Macedonian legions to march immediately on Italy. Furthermore, exploiting the Senate's ruling that all of Caesar's acts are legal, Antony began forging state documents, passing new laws, and bribing officials while claiming it was what Caesar had wanted. The Senate knew he was lying, but was powerless to stop him. Watching Antony seize the state, Cicero bitterly noted the assassins' fatal mistake. Why didn't they kill Antony too? The province of Cisalpine Gaul was currently governed by Decimus Brutus, the second in line in Caesar's will and one of his assassins. Antony marched north, intending to rip the province from Decimus by force, and besieged him at the city of Mutina. Back in Rome, Cicero aggressively lobbied the Senate to legitimize Octavian. He argued, "Do not underestimate this young man. He possesses divine courage. We need him, or Antony will destroy us all." Guided by Cicero, the Senate inducted the 19-year-old Octavian into their ranks on January 1st, 43 BC, formally legalizing his military command. Cicero believed the boy was politically naive. He intended to use Octavian's army to crush Antony and then discard the boy, exactly as the Senate had once tried to use Pompey against Caesar. But Octavian was not Pompey, and Antony was not Caesar. Meanwhile, the eastern provinces collapsed. The remaining Macedonian troops mutinied, kidnapped Antony's brother, and defected to the assassin Marcus Brutus. In Syria, Antony's ally Dolabella was overthrown and replaced by Cassius. The two masterminds of the assassination had successfully hijacked the entire eastern half of the empire. In Italy, the Senate dispatched its two consuls, Hirtius and Pansa, to join forces with Octavian and break Antony's siege at Mutina. In April 43 BC, the combined forces clashed with Antony at Forum Gallorum and Mutina. Antony was decisively beaten and forced to abandon Italy, fleeing across the Alps to link up with Lepidus. But in the brutal fighting, both Roman consuls were killed. Through sheer attrition, command of the Senate's 4 new legions fell squarely into Octavian's lap. Adding his original forces, the 19-year-old now commanded an army of 8 veteran legions. With massive military leverage, Octavian's political demands skyrocketed. Antony had been declared an enemy of the state, and the Senate had formally recognized the assassin's control of the East. Believing the crisis was handled, the Senate turned cold toward Octavian. In July, Octavian sent his officers to Rome to demand the vacant consulship. The Senate laughed them out of the building. Humiliated, the officers returned to camp and demanded Octavian take the capital by force. He gave the order. In August 43 BC, Octavian marched his legions across the Rubicon, mirroring the exact path of his adoptive father. The Senate frantically recalled legions from North Africa to defend the city, but the moment Octavian arrived, the defenders defected. The Senate surrendered. On August 16th, backed by 11 legions, Octavian marched into Rome and forced his election as consul. His first act was to legally cement his adoption, officially becoming Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus. His second act was to pass a law declaring every man involved in Caesar's murder a traitor to the state, legally stripping Brutus and Cassius of their military commands. He immediately followed this by revoking the decrees that labeled Antony and Lepidus enemies of the state. In October, Octavian, Antony, and Lepidus met in Bononia. They realized that fighting a 3-way war of attrition was suicidal, especially when they faced a massive, unified enemy in the east. They struck a deal, forming a legal, dictatorial alliance, the Second Triumvirate. The Triumvirate marched their combined legions back to Rome and initiated a psychotic wave of vengeance and extortion. They issued the infamous proscriptions, legal hit lists. Anyone on the list was stripped of their citizenship. Anyone could kill them. Anyone sheltering them would be executed, and anyone who brought a severed head to the triumvirate received a cut of the dead man's estate. What began as a list of a few hundred political enemies rapidly ballooned to over 2,000 targets. The purge served 2 purposes. First, the triumvirs believed Caesar had been killed because he was too merciful. They intended to permanently exterminate the opposition. Second, the list was packed with innocent, wealthy aristocrats. The triumvirate needed massive amounts of cash to pay their armies, and state-sanctioned murder was the fastest way to liquidate private assets. Cicero, the philosophical heart of the Republic, did not escape. In December 43 BC, realizing he had critically misjudged Octavian, the old statesman accepted his fate and offered his neck to the assassins. His severed head and hands were nailed to the rostra in the Roman Forum. Following the Purges, the state took a definitive step toward autocracy. On January 1st, 42 BC, the Senate officially deified Julius Caesar. As his adopted son, Octavian legally assumed the title Divi Filius, son of a god. This gave his rule divine legitimacy and framed the upcoming war against the assassins as a holy crusade. In the east, Brutus and Cassius had amassed a terrifying force of 20 legions. In September 42 BC, the two massive armies collided at Philippi in Greece. Octavian and Antony fielded roughly 120,000 men. Brutus and Cassius commanded over 100,000. Despite the unprecedented scale of the battle, the tactical execution was chaotic. Both sides suffered from fractured, uncoordinated command structures, and none of the generals possessed the genius of Caesar or Pompey. In the clash of the novices, Brutus shattered Octavian's lines and overran his camp, but found it empty. In the clash of the veterans, Antony crushed Cassius's defenses and took his command post, but failed to capture him. The battlefield was a bloody stalemate. However, Cassius had retreated to high ground. Blinded by thick dust and demoralized by his own defeat, he mistakenly believed Brutus had also been routed. Overcome with despair, Cassius committed suicide. Stripped of his tactical partner, Brutus consolidated his forces and launched a final, desperate assault on October 23rd. He was decisively crushed. Refusing to be captured, Brutus fell on his own sword. The Battle of Philippi broke the back of the Republican resistance forever. The ideological war for the soul of Rome was over, and the autocratic regime of Antony and Octavian had won. Following Philippi, the prestige of Antony and Octavian skyrocketed, while Lepidus was systematically marginalized. Over the next decade, Octavian ruthlessly consolidated the West. He wiped out Pompey's son Sextus in the Mediterranean, stripped Lepidus of his legions, and pacified Illyria, turning Europe into his personal fortress. Meanwhile, Antony governed the East. He launched a disastrous military campaign against Parthia and became deeply entangled, both romantically and politically, with Cleopatra VII of Egypt. For 10 years, the two warlords maintained a fragile, heavily armed truce, fighting a vicious proxy war of propaganda. Octavian painted Antony as a corrupted Roman, seduced by Eastern decadence and enslaved by an Egyptian. Antony fired back, labeling Octavian a physical coward who hid in his tent while others fought his battles. The Cold War finally went hot due to Antony's catastrophic political blunders. He married Cleopatra and began carving off Roman provinces in the East, gifting them to her children. Worse, he explicitly stated in his will that he wished to be buried in Alexandria, not Rome. Octavian seized the political ammunition. He illegally seized and published Antony's will, exposing it to the Senate. For the Roman public, an Eastern burial was an unforgivable betrayal. Octavian knew the Roman people were exhausted by decades of civil war. He immediately shifted the political narrative, framing a naked power grab as a holy war for Roman survival. He did not declare war on Mark Antony. In the summer of 32 BC, the Roman Republic formally declared war on the foreign queen of Egypt. The fate of the Roman world was decided on the western coast of Greece. Octavian and his brilliant admiral Agrippa commanded 90,000 infantry and 400 warships. Antony and Cleopatra fielded 100,000 infantry and 520 warships. After months of skirmishes, Octavian executed a suffocating strategic blockade, pinning Antony's forces at the coastal promontory of Actium. Cut off from supplies, Antony's Roman generals begged him to abandon the ships and fight a traditional land battle where their infantry held the advantage, but Cleopatra insisted they break out by sea. In the autumn of 31 BC, Antony caved to the queen. The optics of a Roman commander taking orders from a foreign monarch shattered his army's morale, triggering massive desertions. On September 2nd, the naval battle of Actium began. Using the wind, Antony's heavy warships violently engaged Octavian's fleet. The ocean became a chaotic inferno of ramming ships and flaming artillery. As the battle ground into a brutal stalemate, Cleopatra, stationed in the rear echelon, panicked. When the wind shifted north, she ordered the Egyptian fleet to raise their sails and flee the battlefield. Seeing his queen run, Antony abandoned his flagship, boarded a fast skiff, and fled right behind her, leaving his men dying in the water. Agrippa instantly closed the trap, severing Antony's escape route and isolating the remaining fleet. Abandoned by their commander, Antony's massive land army and surviving naval forces surrendered to Octavian in disgust. After Actium, Octavian relentlessly hunted them down, pushing through Asia Minor and into Syria and Egypt. Seeing the shift in power, the eastern client states immediately cut ties with Egypt and swore loyalty to Octavian. Cornered in Alexandria with no hope of survival, Antony and Cleopatra both committed suicide. The ancient kingdom of Egypt, which had stood for thousands of years, was erased and absorbed as a personal province of the Roman Empire. Octavian was only 33 years old. Over 15 brutal years, starting as an 18-year-old boy inheriting a dangerous name, he had navigated the deadliest political environment in human history. He avenged his father, purged the assassins, installed a dictatorship, crushed the republic, expanded the borders, and finally annihilated Mark Antony, achieving the complete unification of the Roman world. In August 29 BC, Octavian returned to Rome in triumph, hosting 3 consecutive, magnificent parades that mirrored the glory of Caesar. He was now the undisputed sole master of the Mediterranean. In 28 BC, deeply aware of why his adoptive father was murdered, Octavian restructured the state. He did not call himself a king. He built an inner cabinet, implemented a dual administration system, and maintained exclusive control over the military while painstakingly preserving the outward illusion of the old republic. He overhauled the tax code, established an urban police force, and funded massive public works, turning the bloody, fractured Roman state into a highly systematic, functional empire. In 27 BC, the Roman Senate formally granted Octavian the title Augustus, the revered one. With that single act, the Roman Republic, which had survived 5 centuries of blood, fire, and political chaos, quietly ceased to exist. There were no more marching armies and no more violent elections in the Forum. The fate of the Mediterranean was no longer decided by the shouts of the citizens, but by the quiet nod of a single man. The Roman Empire had begun.